Welcome, weary soul, to a journey through the shadows of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where childhood joy and unspeakable tragedy intertwine like golden threads in a tapestry of sorrow. Tonight, we'll unravel the enigma of Golden Freddy, that phantom animatronic whose very existence challenges our understanding of life, death, and the spaces between. This is not merely a tale of haunted machines, but a meditation on memory, guilt, and the way pain can echo across generations. So settle into the darkness. Let your mind drift like dust motes in forgotten light, and prepare to walk with us through the mystery that has no easy answers. There's no rush here, only the patient unveiling of truth. In the beginning, before the screams and the silence, before the ghosts in the machines and the children who never came home, there was simply a dream. It was the kind of dream that blooms in the hearts of inventors and entrepreneurs. A vision of wonder that promised to transform the mundane reality of everyday life into something magical, something that would bring families together and fill the world with the sound of children's laughter echoing through halls designed specifically for joy. This dream belonged to two men whose names would become forever intertwined with both creation and destruction, their legacy written in equal measures of innovation and tragedy. William Afton and Henry Emily stood at the threshold of the 1970s, their minds brimming with possibilities that seemed as endless as the imagination of the children they hoped to entertain. They were partners in the truest sense, their different skills and perspectives combining to create something neither could have achieved alone. Henry Emily possessed the soul of an artist trapped within the mind of an engineer, a rare combination that allowed him to envision mechanical creations that transcended mere functionality to become something approaching art. His fingers could coax life from metal and wire, his understanding of robotics so intuitive that it seemed less like learned knowledge and more like an innate gift bestowed by whatever forces govern creativity and inspiration. William Afton, meanwhile, brought to their partnership a different kind of genius, one rooted in understanding people rather than machines. He could read a crowd with the skill of a seasoned performer, knew instinctively what would make children gasp with delight and parents reach willingly for their wallets. Where Henry created the magic, William understood how to sell it, how to package wonder in ways that transformed it from mere spectacle into profitable enterprise. Together, they conceived of something that had never existed before in quite the same form. A restaurant where families could gather not just to eat, but to experience wonder, where animatronic performers would provide entertainment so sophisticated and engaging that the line between mechanical performance and living artistry would blur beyond recognition. They called their creation Fredbear's Family Diner, and the name itself spoke to their highest aspirations for what they hoped to build together. The centerpiece of their vision was a character that would become both beloved icon and cursed symbol, depending on the perspective of those who encountered him. Fredbear was Henry's masterpiece, a golden-furred animatronic bear whose design seemed to capture something essential about childhood wonder and parental protection. Standing tall and proud with his purple bow tie and top hat, Fredbear embodied the warmth and security that children sought in their stuffed animals and bedtime stories. Yet, Fredbear was more than just another animatronic performer. He represented the cutting edge of entertainment technology, a marvel of engineering that combined sophisticated robotics with an innovation that would prove to be both revolutionary and cursed. The spring-lock mechanism that allowed a single costume to serve dual purposes as both autonomous performer and wearable suit. The spring-lock technology was Henry's attempt to solve a practical problem that had plagued the early days of animatronic entertainment. During operating hours, characters like Fredbear needed to move independently, their every gesture and expression programmed to delight and engage their young audience. But there were also times when human performers needed to wear the costumes directly, whether for special events, private parties, or simply to provide the kind of personal interaction that even the most sophisticated robot could not fully replicate. Traditional solutions to this dual need were clunky and expensive, requiring entirely separate costumes and mechanical systems that doubled the cost and complexity of each character. Henry's spring lock innovation promised to eliminate this redundancy through an elegant mechanism that could secure the animatronic components in place during autonomous operation, then compress them safely against the costume's interior walls when a human performer needed to wear the suit. The system worked through a series of spring-loaded locks that held the animatronic endoskeleton in its performance position. When activated, these springs would compress with tremendous force, creating just enough space within the costume for a human performer to squeeze inside. The transformation was remarkable to witness, as what had moments before been a hulking mechanical performer would suddenly become hollow enough to accommodate a living person. Yet this technological marvel came with dangers that would only become apparent through bitter experience. The springs that made the system possible were under constant tension, their compressed state representing a tremendous amount of stored energy that wanted nothing more than to be released. The slightest malfunction, the tiniest breach in the delicate balance of forces, could cause the springs to snap back to their natural position with devastating speed and power. William and Henry understood these risks, at least in theory. They developed protocols and safety procedures, rules about when and where the suits could be worn, warnings about the importance of keeping them dry, and avoiding sudden movements that might disturb the spring mechanisms. They trained their employees carefully, emphasizing the critical importance of following every safety guideline without exception. But understanding danger and preventing it are two very different things, especially when that danger is woven into the very fabric of a technology that seems like magic to those who use it. The spring-lock suits were seductive in their versatility, seemingly perfect solutions to problems that had plagued the industry for years. It was easy to become complacent, easy to forget that every time someone climbed inside one of these golden costumes, they were literally surrounding themselves with mechanisms that could kill them in an instant. Fredbear's family diner opened to the kind of reception that exceeded even William's most optimistic projections. Families flocked to experience this new form of entertainment, children pressing close to the stage as Fredbear performed his songs and told his stories with mechanical precision that somehow felt more alive and engaging than many human performers could manage. The restaurant became a destination, a place where birthday parties were transformed into unforgettable experiences, and ordinary meals became the backdrop for magical encounters. The success of Fredbear's led naturally to expansion, to dreams of franchise opportunities, and nationwide chains that would carry their vision to every corner of the country. But with success came new pressures, new complications that neither William nor Henry had fully anticipated. The demands of running a successful business began to pull them in different directions, their partnership strained by disagreements over everything from creative control to financial priorities. Henry remained focused on perfecting his mechanical creations, driven by an artist's compulsion to push the boundaries of what was possible in animatronic entertainment. He envisioned more sophisticated characters, more complex performances, technological innovations that would keep their restaurants at the forefront of the industry. For him, success was measured not just in profits, but in the gasps of wonder from children encountering his creations for the first time. William, meanwhile, found himself increasingly consumed by the business side of their operation, the endless demands of managing growth and maintaining profitability in an industry where customer expectations were constantly rising. He began to see Henry's perfectionist tendencies as obstacles rather than assets, expensive delays that prevented them from capitalizing on their early success before competitors could catch up. These tensions might have remained manageable disagreements between partners, creative differences that could be resolved through compromise and mutual respect. But there was something else growing in the shadows of their success, something darker and more troubling that would eventually consume everything they had built together. William Afton was changing, though the transformation was so gradual that even those closest to him failed to recognize its significance until far too late. The cheerful showman who had once delighted in bringing joy to families was slowly being replaced by someone colder, more calculating, whose interest in children seemed to have shifted from entertainment to something far more sinister. The first signs were subtle, the kind of behavioral changes that could easily be attributed to the stress of running a growing business. William began spending more time alone with the animatronics, claiming he was studying their mechanisms to better understand how to improve their performance. He developed an unusual interest in the restaurant's security systems, in knowing exactly when staff members would be absent and which areas would be unmonitored. Most troubling of all, several parents began to report that their children had complained about William's behavior during private interactions, describing encounters that made the adults uncomfortable, even when they couldn't quite articulate why. These reports were vague and difficult to verify, the kind of concerns that could be dismissed as misunderstandings or overprotective paranoia. Henry, absorbed in his own work and trusting in the partnership that had brought them so far, failed to recognize the warning signs that might have prevented the tragedy that was slowly taking shape around them. He saw William's changing behavior through the lens of their shared history, attributing any unusual actions to the pressures they were both experiencing as their business grew beyond their original dreams. But some changes cannot be explained away by stress or ambition. Something fundamental was shifting in William Afton's relationship with the world around him. A transformation that would eventually reveal itself in ways that no one could have imagined or prepared for. The man who had helped create a place of joy and wonder was becoming something else entirely, though the full horror of that transformation would not become apparent until it was far too late to prevent. The golden bear that stood at the center of their success continued to perform his programmed routines, his mechanical movements, bringing delight to countless children who saw in him everything that was magical about childhood. Yet Fredbear had become something more than just an animatronic performer. He was the physical embodiment of dreams and aspirations, a symbol of what Henry and William had hoped to achieve when they first decided to work together. Soon, that same golden figure would become associated with nightmares rather than dreams, his cheerful visage forever linked with tragedy and loss in ways that would echo across generations. The spring-lock technology that had made him possible would prove to be both revolutionary innovation and instrument of horror, while the partnership between his creators would dissolve into something far darker than mere business disagreement. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would transform Fredbear from beloved entertainer into something far more complex and troubling. The golden bear who had brought so much joy to so many families was about to become the unwitting centerpiece of events that would haunt the Afton family and countless others for decades to come. In the cheerful dining halls of Fredbear's family diner, where children laughed and families gathered in happiness, the seeds of a mystery were already being planted that would one day bloom into questions that still defy easy answers. The spring-lock mechanisms continued to compress and release with mechanical precision. Their stored energy, a constant reminder that even the most wonderful innovations carry within them the potential for destruction. And in the shadows of success, William Afton continued his slow transformation from partner to predator, his changing nature hidden behind the same cheerful facade that had once been genuine but was now becoming merely a mask worn to conceal darker purposes. The golden age of Fredbear's family diner was drawing to a close, though none who worked there or visited there could have imagined the horror that was about to unfold. The innocence that had made their success possible was about to be shattered forever, leaving behind fragments of broken dreams and haunted memories that would prove impossible to put back together again. In the months that followed the diner's initial success, a new member joined the Afton household, a child who would become central to the growing tragedy that surrounded the golden bear. William's youngest son was a sensitive boy whose large eyes seemed to hold depths of understanding that were unusual for someone so young, as if he could perceive things that others missed or chose to ignore. The child was drawn to Fredbear with an intensity that went beyond normal childhood fascination with toys or entertainment. He spoke to the golden bear as if it were a living friend, carrying conversations that seemed to suggest the animatronic was somehow responding to his words. His father's work meant that he spent countless hours in the restaurant, and during those hours, Fredbear became his constant companion and confidant. Yet there was something troubling about the boy's relationship with the golden bear, something that suggested fear mixed with his obvious affection. He would sometimes be found cowering in corners after encountering Fredbear during his autonomous performances, claiming that the bear had looked at him in ways that made him uncomfortable. Other times, he would speak of Fredbear as if the animatronic had warned him about dangers that only he could perceive. William's older son, Michael, represented a very different response to the family business and its mechanical stars. Where his younger brother saw mystery and potential menace in the animatronics, Michael saw only opportunities for mischief and pranks. He delighted in frightening his sensitive sibling, using masks and costumes to create elaborate scares that left the younger boy in tears. The dynamic between the two brothers became a source of constant tension in the Afton household, with the older boy's cruelty escalating as his victim's fear grew more pronounced. Michael seemed incapable of understanding or caring about the genuine terror he inflicted, treating his brother's distress as nothing more than entertainment for himself and his friends. Henry Emily watched these family dynamics with growing concern, recognizing that something unhealthy was developing within his partner's household, but uncertain how to address problems that seemed to fall outside the boundaries of their business relationship. He could see that William's youngest son was genuinely frightened of the animatronics, while the older boy's behavior toward his sibling was becoming increasingly aggressive and cruel. The situation reached its inevitable conclusion on a day that started like any other, but would end with tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. It was the younger boy's birthday, a celebration that should have been filled with joy and laughter, but instead became the setting for the most devastating prank that Michael and his friends had ever conceived. The details of what happened that day would be recounted and re-examined countless times, each retelling adding new layers of horror to an event that was already almost too terrible to comprehend. Michael and his friends, emboldened by past successes and convinced that their victim's fears were nothing more than childish nonsense, decided to give the birthday boy a closer look at his beloved Fredbear than he had ever experienced before. They lifted the crying, struggling child toward Fredbear's mechanical jaws, intending nothing more than a momentary scare that would send him running home in tears. It was meant to be the culmination of years of successful bullying, the ultimate prank that would prove once and for all how foolish his fears had been. But the spring lock mechanisms that made Fredbear possible were more delicate than anyone realized, and the moisture from the child's tears, combined with the stress of his struggling to create exactly the kind of conditions that the safety protocols had been designed to prevent. The springs that held the animatronic components in their proper positions began to loosen, their grip on the mechanical jaws becoming unstable in ways that would have triggered immediate shutdown procedures if anyone had been monitoring the situation. What followed happened with the terrible speed that characterizes all truly devastating accidents, faster than thought or intervention, a cascade of mechanical failure that transformed a cruel prank into an unspeakable tragedy. The animatronic jaws, no longer properly secured by their spring mechanisms, snapped shut with all the force that had been stored in the compressed springs. The sound that echoed through Fredbear's family diner in that moment was unlike anything that had ever been heard in a place designed for family entertainment, a mechanical grinding mixed with something far more terrible that sent everyone in the restaurant into immediate panic. The cheerful atmosphere that had defined the establishment was shattered instantly and permanently, replaced by screams and chaos and the kind of horror that no amount of time or distance can ever fully erase. The boy who had spent so many hours speaking to Fredbear as if the golden bear were his friend became the victim of the very creature he had both loved and feared. The spring lock mechanisms that represented the cutting edge of entertainment technology became the instruments of a tragedy that would transform everyone involved, turning a family celebration into a nightmare that would echo across generations. Michael Afton found himself transformed in that instant from mischievous older brother to something far more terrible, the direct cause of his siblings' catastrophic injuries, and the bearer of guilt that no child should ever have to carry. His friends scattered in panic and horror, their participation in the prank becoming a shared trauma that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. William Afton arrived at the hospital to find his youngest son clinging to life with injuries so severe that the doctors could offer no hope for meaningful recovery. The child who had once chattered endlessly about his conversations with Fredbear now lay silent and still, his large eyes vacant of the awareness that had once made them so expressive and knowing. For days that felt like years, the family maintained their vigil beside the hospital bed, watching for any sign that the boy might somehow recover from injuries that had damaged not just his body, but the very essence of who he had been. William found himself making bargains with forces he didn't believe in, promising anything and everything if only his son could be restored to the bright, sensitive child he had been before the accident. But some injuries transcend the purely physical, cutting so deep into the fabric of existence that healing becomes impossible through any conventional means. The boy lingered in a state that was neither truly living nor completely dead, his breathing maintained by machines while his consciousness drifted somewhere between worlds, unreachable despite his family's desperate attempts to call him back. When the end finally came, it arrived not with dramatic struggle but with a quiet cessation that left behind a silence more terrible than any scream. The monitoring equipment fell still, the rhythmic sounds that had marked the boundary between hope and despair giving way to the flat tone that medical professionals know signals the final frontier between life and death. The funeral that followed was a small, private affair attended by family and the few friends who felt capable of facing the magnitude of the tragedy that had occurred. Henry Emily stood beside his partner as they lowered the small casket into the ground, both men understanding that they were burying not just a child but the innocence that had once defined their shared dreams. William Afton emerged from his son's funeral as a fundamentally different person than the man who had entered it. The grief that consumed him was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed to hollow out everything that had once defined his personality and replace it with something else entirely. The cheerful showman, who had delighted in bringing joy to families, was gone, replaced by someone whose relationship with the world had been permanently altered by loss. Yet grief was not the only emotion that took root in the devastated landscape of William's psyche. Alongside the sorrow grew something darker and more corrosive, an anger that sought targets for blame and revenge. He looked at Henry's continued success with their business ventures and saw betrayal rather than partnership. He observed other families enjoying the entertainment they had created together and felt rage rather than satisfaction. Most troubling of all, William began to develop an obsession with the children who visited their establishments, but his interest had nothing to do with providing entertainment or creating joy. Instead, he seemed to study them with the intensity of a predator examining potential prey, his motivations shifting from creation to something far more sinister. The spring-lock technology that had claimed his son became both symbol and tool of his transformation. The mechanical precision of the suits, appealing to the calculating coldness that was replacing his former warmth. He began spending hours alone with the animatronics, claiming to be working on improvements and maintenance, but actually planning something far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The stage was set for tragedies that would make the loss of William's son seem like merely the first movement in a symphony of horror that would span decades and claim countless innocent lives. The golden bear that had once brought joy to families was about to become associated with mysteries and horrors that would challenge every assumption about life, death, and the spaces between. Fredbear's family diner continued to operate in the aftermath of the tragedy, but the restaurant had been fundamentally changed by what had occurred within its walls. Staff members who had been present during the accident found themselves unable to look at the animatronics without remembering the sounds they had heard and the sights they had witnessed. Families who had once considered the establishment a safe haven for entertainment began to question whether such places could ever truly be secure. The partnership between William and Henry, already strained by the pressures of success, began to dissolve under the weight of tragedy and the different ways the two men processed their shared loss. Henry retreated into his work, throwing himself into technological improvements that might prevent similar accidents from occurring. William, meanwhile, was planning something far darker, his grief and rage combining to create motivations that would soon manifest in ways that no one could have predicted or prevented. The golden bear continued to perform his programmed routines, his mechanical movements unchanged by the tragedy that had occurred around him. Yet something indefinable had shifted in the atmosphere surrounding Fredbear, as if the trauma of that terrible day had left impressions that transcended the purely physical. Some visitors reported feeling watched when no one was there, while others claimed to hear sounds that had no obvious source. The boy who had died clutching onto life in a hospital bed had loved Fredbear with the pure, uncomplicated affection that only children can feel for the objects of their fascination. His spirit, if such things existed, would have reason to linger near the golden bear that had been both friend and destroyer, creating the first tentative connection between the world of the living and whatever realm the dead inhabit. This connection, barely perceptible at first, would grow stronger over time as more tragedies accumulated around the golden figure. The springlock mechanisms that had claimed one life would claim others, while the man whose grief had been transformed into something monstrous would use those same mechanisms to commit crimes that would bind additional souls to the animatronic performers. The foundation had been laid for a haunting that would span generations, a mystery that would intertwine the fates of the living and the dead in ways that defied easy explanation. The golden bear that stood at the center of it all would become something far more complex than a simple animatronic performer, transformed by tragedy and supernatural forces into an entity that existed somewhere between the mechanical and the spiritual. The age of innocence was ending at Fredbear's family diner, replaced by something darker and more complex that would echo through the decades to come. The cheerful exterior would be maintained, the performances would continue, but underneath the surface, forces were stirring that would eventually transform the entire franchise into something that bore little resemblance to the dreams that had inspired its creation. The year 1985 arrived like any other, its calendar pages turning with the same inevitable rhythm that had marked the passage of time since the beginning of recorded history. Yet within the walls of the newest Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, forces were converging that would transform this ordinary year into something far more sinister, a moment when the thin barriers between innocence and evil would be torn away to reveal horrors that no family restaurant should ever contain. By this time, the franchise had evolved far beyond its humble origins at Fredbear's Family Diner. The success of Henry Emily's animatronic innovations had spawned a chain of restaurants, each one featuring more sophisticated mechanical performers and more elaborate entertainment systems designed to captivate audiences of children and their families. The tragic events that had claimed William Afton's youngest son had been carefully buried beneath layers of corporate restructuring and public relations management, relegated to the category of unfortunate accidents that successful businesses learn to overcome and move past. The new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza represented the pinnacle of what the franchise could offer to its customers, a wonderland of mechanical entertainment, where children could celebrate birthdays, families could gather for special occasions, and parents could trust that their most precious treasures would be safe and happy, while surrounded by the cheerful chaos of organized fun. The main dining area buzzed with the constant activity of young voices raised in laughter and excitement, while the stage area showcased animatronic performers whose technological sophistication would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. Freddy Fazbear himself had emerged as the undisputed star of this mechanical ensemble, his brown fur and top hat making him instantly recognizable to children throughout the region. Unlike the spring-lock technology that had made Fredbear so dangerous, these newer animatronics operated on purely autonomous systems, their movements controlled by sophisticated programming that eliminated the need for human performers to ever climb inside the costumes during operating hours. Bonnie the Bunny brought his own brand of musical entertainment to the stage, his purple fur and red bow tie creating a visual complement to Freddy's more traditional appearance. The guitar that never left his mechanical hands seemed to play itself with supernatural skill, producing melodies that stayed with listeners long after they had left the restaurant and returned to their ordinary lives. Chica the Chicken rounded out the main trio of performers, her yellow plumage and cheerful demeanor making her an instant favorite among the younger children who visited the establishment. The cupcake that she carried everywhere had become something of a mascot within a mascot. Its simple design, somehow capturing the essence of childhood joy in ways that more sophisticated creations often failed to achieve. But it was the fourth member of this mechanical family who would prove most significant to the events that were about to unfold. Foxy the pirate fox had been relegated to his own separate area of the restaurant, a space called Pirate Cove, where his more theatrical performances could unfold without interfering with the main stage entertainment. His red fur was worn and patched, giving him a weathered appearance that added authenticity to his seafaring persona. The children who visited Freddy Fazbear's Pizza during this golden period of the franchise's existence had no way of knowing that they were witnessing the calm before a storm of unimaginable proportions. They saw only wonder and excitement, mechanical marvels that seemed to embody the very essence of childhood fantasy brought to life through the miracle of modern technology. Their parents, watching from nearby tables while their offspring shrieked with delight, felt the satisfaction that comes from providing experiences that would become treasured memories in years to come. Yet, beneath this surface of family-friendly entertainment, William Afton was preparing to commit acts that would forever alter the nature of everything the franchise represented. The grief and rage that had consumed him since his son's death had not diminished with time, but had instead fermented into something far more dangerous, a concentrated hatred that sought targets among the very children whose happiness had once brought him professional satisfaction. The springlock suits that had claimed his son's life were still part of the restaurant's inventory, stored in back rooms where they waited to be used for special occasions that required human performers to interact directly with guests. William had spent countless hours studying these suits, ostensibly for safety improvements, but actually planning how their unique properties could be exploited for purposes that had nothing to do with entertainment. The yellow spring Bonnie costume had become his particular obsession, its cheerful exterior hiding mechanisms that could serve as both disguise and weapon in the hands of someone who understood their operation. Unlike the newer animatronics that performed on stage, the springlock suits retained the dual nature that had made them revolutionary and dangerous, capable of housing either mechanical components or human occupants, depending on the position of their internal mechanisms. William's knowledge of the restaurant's security systems, gained through years of partnership with Henry Emily, gave him unprecedented access to areas that should have been secure, and times when surveillance would be minimal or non-existent. He knew which cameras had blind spots, which entrances were monitored least carefully, and which periods of the day offered the greatest opportunities for activities that could not be witnessed or recorded. The first child to fall victim to William's transformed nature was a little girl whose name would be lost to time, but whose spirit would prove to have a strength that transcended physical death. She had been celebrating her birthday at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, surrounded by friends and family who believed they were providing her with memories that would last a lifetime. The irony was cruel beyond measure, for the memories created that day would indeed last far longer than any human lifetime, though not in the way her loved ones had intended. The child had wandered away from her party, drawn by curiosity toward an area of the restaurant that was supposed to be off-limits to customers. It was a common occurrence in establishments designed to stimulate young imaginations, and the staff had developed protocols for gently redirecting such exploration back toward approved areas. But on this particular day, the person she encountered in that restricted space was not a helpful employee, but William Afton, wearing the spring Bonnie costume and presenting himself as a special performer who had come to make her birthday celebration even more memorable. Children of that age possess an innate trust in adults who present themselves as authority figures, especially when those adults are associated with places and activities that represent safety and fun. The little girl followed the yellow rabbit without hesitation, believing she was being led to some special surprise that her parents had arranged as part of her birthday celebration. What happened in the back rooms of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that day violated every assumption about the safety that such establishments were supposed to provide to their young customers. The cheerful exterior of the Spring Bonnie costume concealed the actions of a man who had allowed his grief to transform into something monstrous, his rage at the loss of his own child twisted into a hatred that sought to inflict similar loss upon other families. The child's disappearance was noticed almost immediately by her frantic parents, who had assumed she was playing in some other area of the restaurant, but gradually realized that she was nowhere to be found within the public spaces. The staff launched an immediate search of the premises, checking every booth and play area where a young child might hide or become lost, but their efforts revealed no trace of the missing girl. The police were called within the hour, transforming the cheerful atmosphere of the family restaurant into something far more serious and frightening. Officers interviewed staff members and searched areas that customers never saw, looking for any clue that might explain how a child could simply vanish from what should have been a secure environment. But William Afton's knowledge of the building's layout and security systems had allowed him to commit his crime and dispose of the evidence in ways that left no obvious trail for investigators to follow. The child's body was hidden within the very structure of the restaurant itself, concealed in spaces that had been designed for maintenance access, but could serve other, more sinister purposes when necessary. The investigation continued for weeks, with detectives pursuing every possible lead and theory about what might have happened to the missing child. Her photograph appeared on local news broadcasts and missing person flyers, while her family offered increasingly desperate pleas for information about her whereabouts. The entire community was shaken by the disappearance. The idea that a child could vanish from a place specifically designed for family entertainment, challenging everyone's assumptions about safety and security. Yet even as the investigation continued, William Afton was already planning his next attack. The success of his first crime had proven that his methods were effective, and that the restaurant's environment provided him with opportunities that would be difficult to replicate in other settings. The springlock suit had served its purpose perfectly, providing both disguise and psychological advantage over children who were naturally inclined to trust figures that appeared to be part of the entertainment. The second victim was a boy whose love for the animatronic performers had led him to spend countless hours studying their movements and memorizing their programmed routines. He knew every song in Freddy's repertoire, could imitate Bonnie's guitar-playing gestures with perfect accuracy, and had begged his parents for a foxy action figure that he carried with him everywhere he went. This child's deep fascination with the mechanical performers made him particularly vulnerable to William's approach, as the man in the spring Bonnie costume was able to exploit the boy's enthusiasm by promising access to areas where the real animatronics were maintained and repaired. The child followed eagerly, believing he was being offered the kind of behind-the-scenes access that represented the fulfillment of his deepest wishes about the restaurant. The pattern established with the first victim was repeated with methodical precision, William's growing confidence in his methods, allowing him to take greater risks while maintaining the careful planning that kept his activities hidden from detection. The boy's disappearance created the same cycle of panic, investigation, and frustrated failure to find answers, while another family was left to confront the unimaginable reality that their child had simply vanished without a trace. The third child to fall prey to William's predations was a girl whose gentle nature and kind heart had made her beloved among her classmates and teachers. She possessed an empathy that was unusual for someone so young, always the first to comfort a friend who was upset or share her toys with children who had none of their own. Her parents had brought her to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza as a reward for her excellent report card, never imagining that their attempt to celebrate her achievements would lead to tragedy. This child's trusting nature made her particularly susceptible to William's manipulation, as she was naturally inclined to help when the man in the spring Bonnie costume claimed that one of the animatronics needed assistance. Her desire to be helpful overrode any caution she might have felt about following a stranger, especially when that stranger appeared to be an official representative of the establishment her family had chosen for their celebration. The fourth victim was a boy whose boundless energy and enthusiasm for life had made him a favorite among the restaurant's staff members. He was the kind of child who remembered everyone's name, who always said please and thank you, and who seemed to find joy in every experience, no matter how mundane it might seem to others. His laughter was infectious, his smile genuine, and his presence seemed to make everyone around him feel a little happier just by being near him. William's choice of this particular child seemed especially cruel, as if he were deliberately targeting the qualities that made childhood precious and innocent. The boy's natural curiosity about how things worked made him eager to learn about the animatronic's inner mechanisms, while his trusting relationship with authority figures prevented him from recognizing the danger he was walking into when he followed the costumed figure away from the safety of the main dining area. The pattern continued with the fifth and final child, a victim whose identity would become perhaps the most significant of all, though the full implications of this significance would not become clear until much later in the unfolding tragedy. This child possessed a strength of spirit that transcended physical size or age, a determination that seemed almost adult in its intensity despite being housed in such a young form. Unlike the previous victims, this final child seemed to sense that something was wrong about the situation from the very beginning. There was a wariness in the way this young soul regarded the spring Bonnie costume, an intuitive understanding that the cheerful exterior concealed something dangerous and predatory. Yet the child was alone in a back area of the restaurant, separated from parents and friends by circumstances that made escape impossible and help unavailable. The struggle that ensued was different from the previous encounters, marked by a resistance and fighting spirit that seemed to surprise even William Afton. This child refused to go quietly, refused to submit without a fight, and in doing so planted the seeds of what would eventually become William's own destruction. The rage and determination that marked this final victim's last moments would prove to have consequences that extended far beyond the physical realm, creating spiritual forces that would eventually seek justice for all the children who had suffered. With the completion of his fifth murder, William Afton had transformed from grieving father into something monstrous, a predator who had violated the most fundamental trust that society places in institutions designed to serve and protect children. The spring Bonnie costume that had enabled his crimes was stained with horrors that no amount of cleaning could ever truly remove, while the restaurant itself had become a tomb that concealed evidence of unspeakable acts. The disappearance of 5 children from the same establishment over such a relatively short period of time created a level of public attention and police scrutiny that threatened to expose William's activities. The media began referring to the missing children incident, treating it as a single event rather than a series of individual crimes, while investigators struggled to find connections between victims who seemed to have nothing in common except their presence at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on the days they vanished. The pressure of the investigation forced changes in the restaurant's operations, with new security measures and staff protocols designed to prevent any future incidents. Yet these changes came too late to help the 5 children who had already fallen victim to William's predations, their bodies hidden within the structure of the building, where their families continued to search for answers that would never come through conventional means. But death, it seemed, was not the end of these children's story. In ways that defied scientific explanation but aligned with older, more mystical understandings of justice and spiritual persistence, the murdered children began to manifest their presence in the very place where their lives had been taken. The animatronics that had entertained them in life became the vessels through which their spirits sought to communicate with the world they had been forced to leave behind. The first signs of supernatural activity were subtle enough to be dismissed as mechanical malfunctions or the overactive imaginations of stressed employees. Freddy Fazbear's eyes seemed to track movement, even when his programming should have kept him focused straight ahead. Bonnie's guitar produced sounds that were not part of his recorded repertoire, melodies that seemed to carry emotional weight far beyond what simple mechanical programming could achieve. Chica began to move through the restaurant during hours when all the animatronics should have been completely inactive, her cupcakes somehow ending up in different locations despite no human intervention. Foxy's movements in Pirate Cove became more erratic and unpredictable, as if something other than his original programming was influencing his mechanical systems. But it was a fifth presence that proved most significant to the developing supernatural situation. An entity that did not correspond to any of the 4 main animatronics, but seemed to exist in the spaces between them. This presence manifested inconsistently, appearing sometimes as a golden version of Freddy Fazbear and other times as something less defined, but no less powerful in its spiritual intensity. The 5th child, the one who had fought back against William Afton with such determination and rage, had become something more than just another victim seeking peace or justice. This spirit burned with an anger that transcended normal understanding of childhood emotions, a fury that seemed capable of bending reality itself to serve its desire for vengeance against the man who had committed these atrocities. Unlike the other 4 children, whose spirits seemed content to inhabit the animatronics that had entertained them in life, the 5th victim's essence refused to be contained within any single mechanical form. Instead, it manifested as Golden Freddy, a phantom version of the main character that existed somewhere between the physical and spiritual realms, appearing and disappearing, according to rules that no living person could understand or predict. This Golden Freddy entity possessed abilities that far exceeded those of the other possessed animatronics, capable of teleporting instantly across vast distances and manifesting in locations where no physical form should have been able to exist. More troubling still, Golden Freddy seemed to retain conscious awareness of what had happened to all 5 children, serving as both individual victim and collective memory of the crimes that William Afton had committed. The restaurant staff began to report encounters with this golden figure that left them shaken and confused, unable to explain what they had seen in terms that made rational sense. Security guards working night shifts spoke of finding Golden Freddy sitting motionless in the office, his presence so unexpected and unsettling that several employees quit their positions rather than risk future encounters with whatever force animated the phantom animatronic. William Afton, meanwhile, found himself haunted by manifestations that seemed designed specifically to torment him with reminders of his crimes. Golden Freddy appeared to him more frequently than to anyone else, the phantom's glowing eyes boring into him with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his corrupted soul. The whispered words, "It's me," began to echo through his consciousness, a phrase that carried within it the collective voice of all 5 murdered children. The supernatural activity surrounding the missing children incident represented something unprecedented in the franchise's history, a convergence of tragedy, technology, and spiritual forces that created conditions unlike anything that had been encountered before. The animatronics that had been designed to bring joy to children had become vessels for the spirits of children who had been denied the chance to experience that joy, while the restaurant itself had been transformed from a place of celebration into a monument to loss and injustice. Yet, among all these supernatural manifestations, Golden Freddy remained the most mysterious and powerful, an entity whose very existence seemed to challenge the boundaries between life and death, between the mechanical and the spiritual, between justice and vengeance. The 5th child's refusal to accept death had created something that was neither fully alive nor completely departed, a phantom presence that would prove to have consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The golden figure that appeared in shadows and corners, that materialized without warning and vanished without explanation, represented the embodiment of rage, transformed into supernatural force. This was not the simple haunting of a restless spirit seeking peace, but something far more complex and dangerous, a consciousness that had been forged in the fires of injustice and tempered by the absolute determination to ensure that the crimes committed against innocent children would not go unpunished. The missing children incident of 1985 had ended in terms of William Afton's active predation, but it had also begun something far more enduring and far-reaching. The 5 children who had entered Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on ordinary days, expecting nothing more than the simple pleasures that such establishments were designed to provide, had become something else entirely through the circumstances of their deaths. Their spirits, bound to the mechanical forms that had entertained them in life, would continue to influence events at the restaurant for decades to come. But it was the 5th child, the one who had fought back with such determination and whose rage had been transformed into something transcendent, who would prove to have the greatest impact on the unfolding supernatural drama. Golden Freddy had emerged from the tragedy as something unique in the franchise's history, a phantom presence that existed according to its own rules and pursued its own agenda for justice against the man who had destroyed so many innocent lives. The golden bear that had once represented the pinnacle of family entertainment had become something far more complex and troubling, a supernatural entity whose very existence posed questions about the nature of death, the persistence of consciousness, and the power of righteous anger to transcend the normal boundaries of physical reality. The stage was set for a haunting that would span generations, with Golden Freddy serving as both victim and avenger, both individual spirit and collective memory of innocence destroyed. The mystery that would emerge from these tragic events would prove to defy easy explanation, challenging everyone who encountered it to reconsider their assumptions about life, death, and the possibility that some wrongs are so terrible that they create their own forms of supernatural justice. In the realm of supernatural phenomena that emerged from the tragedy of the missing children incident, Golden Freddy occupied a position unlike any other entity that had manifested within the walls of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. While the other possessed animatronics retained clear connections to their mechanical forms and operated according to rules that, however disturbing, remained somewhat predictable, Golden Freddy existed in a state that defied conventional understanding of both the physical and spiritual worlds. The Phantom's most immediately striking characteristic was its liminal nature, existing simultaneously in multiple states of being without ever fully committing to any single form of existence. Unlike Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, whose spirits had clearly taken residence within existing animatronic shells, Golden Freddy appeared to exist independently of any permanent mechanical housing, manifesting as needed through processes that bore no resemblance to the normal operation of restaurant equipment. This independence from physical constraints gave Golden Freddy abilities that far exceeded those of the other haunted animatronics. Where they were limited by the mechanical capabilities and structural integrity of their robotic bodies, Golden Freddy could appear and disappear at will, moving through space in ways that seemed to ignore fundamental laws of physics and engineering. The entity could manifest instantly in locations where no animatronic had any business being, appearing in office chairs, storage closets, or even areas where the ceiling height would have made the presence of a full-sized mechanical performer physically impossible. The visual appearance of Golden Freddy itself spoke to the entity's unique nature among the supernatural manifestations that haunted the restaurant. Where the other possessed animatronics retained the exact physical characteristics they had possessed during their operational days, Golden Freddy appeared as a distinctly modified version of the familiar Freddy Fazbear design, its golden coloration setting it apart from the brown fur that characterized the stage performer. Yet, this golden hue was not the cheerful, warm gold that one might associate with precious metals or valuable objects. Instead, Golden Freddy's coloration possessed a sickly, faded quality that seemed to shift and change depending on the lighting conditions and the emotional state of whoever was observing the Phantom. In some encounters, the golden fur appeared almost luminous, glowing with an inner light that seemed to emanate from supernatural sources. In others, the same coloration looked dull and lifeless, as if the very concept of gold had been drained of its inherent beauty and value. The entity's physical posture provided perhaps the most disturbing aspect of its visual presentation, challenging every expectation about how animatronic performers were designed to appear during both active and inactive periods. Golden Freddy consistently manifested in a slumped, collapsed position that suggested complete mechanical failure or, more troublingly, the posture of something that had given up all hope of normal function or purpose. This slumped position was not the result of any mechanical malfunction or structural damage that could be repaired through conventional maintenance procedures. Instead, it appeared to be an essential characteristic of Golden Freddy's existence, as if the entity's spiritual nature prevented it from achieving the upright, proudly erect stance that characterized properly functioning animatronic performers. The Phantom sat with its head tilted forward at an unnatural angle, its arms hanging limply at its sides, and its entire form conveying a sense of exhaustion or despair that was deeply unsettling to anyone who encountered it. Yet despite this apparently lifeless posture, Golden Freddy's eyes burned with an intensity that immediately contradicted any impression of inactivity or dormancy. These were not the simple mechanical lights that provided illumination for standard animatronic optical systems, but something far more complex and emotionally charged. The golden glow that emanated from Golden Freddy's eye sockets seemed to contain within it all the rage, sorrow, and determination of the child whose spirit had created this supernatural manifestation. The eyes served as windows into whatever remained of the murdered child's consciousness, revealing emotions and awareness that no mechanical system could have generated through programming or malfunction. Those who encountered Golden Freddy's gaze reported feeling as though they were being examined by something that could see directly into their souls, evaluating their moral character and judging them according to standards that transcended normal human understanding of right and wrong. The intensity of this gaze varied depending on who was observing Golden Freddy and under what circumstances the encounter was taking place. Innocent employees and customers who had no connection to the crimes committed against the 5 children might experience the golden eyes as merely unsettling or mysterious. But for anyone who bore responsibility for or knowledge of the murders, Golden Freddy's stare carried a weight of accusation and promised retribution that could be absolutely terrifying in its implications. William Afton, in particular, found himself subjected to Golden Freddy encounters that seemed specifically designed to torment him with reminders of his crimes and promises of eventual justice. The Phantom would appear to him during moments when he believed himself to be alone and unobserved, materializing without warning in locations where its presence should have been impossible. The golden eyes would fix upon him with an unwavering intensity that seemed to penetrate through every lie he had told himself about his actions and every rationalization he had constructed to justify his predatory behavior. The manner of Golden Freddy's appearances and disappearances further emphasized the entity's fundamental separation from the normal rules that governed both animatronic operation and supernatural manifestation. Unlike the other possessed animatronics, which moved through the restaurant using their mechanical legs and followed predictable paths that corresponded to the building's physical layout, Golden Freddy seemed to exist outside normal spatial constraints entirely. Security cameras would capture empty rooms one moment, only to reveal Golden Freddy sitting motionless in the same space during the next frame of recorded footage. The Phantom could appear behind closed doors without those doors showing any evidence of having been opened, could manifest in sealed storage areas that had no other means of access, and could vanish from locked rooms without leaving any trace of how such an exit might have been accomplished. This ability to ignore physical barriers and spatial limitations gave Golden Freddy a level of access to the restaurant that exceeded even what William Afton had enjoyed during his period of predatory activity. The Phantom could observe activities in areas that were supposed to be completely private, could witness conversations that were meant to be confidential, and could appear in locations where its presence would have the maximum psychological impact on whoever encountered it. The teleportation abilities that Golden Freddy displayed seemed to operate according to principles that had nothing to do with normal understanding of movement or transportation. There were no transition periods, no gradual fading in or out, no indication that the entity was traveling from one location to another through any conventional means. Instead, Golden Freddy would simply not be present in one moment, and then would be completely manifest in the next, as if the Phantom existed in a state where normal concepts of location and distance had no meaning. This instantaneous manifestation ability created encounters that were particularly jarring for anyone who experienced them, as the human mind struggled to process the presence of something that had not been there moments before, and showed no signs of having arrived through normal means. Security guards working night shifts reported having their attention focused on one area of the restaurant, only to turn around and find Golden Freddy sitting motionless behind them, the Phantom's golden eyes already fixed upon them, as if it had been watching their activities for an extended period. The psychological effect of these sudden appearances was amplified by Golden Freddy's complete silence during most encounters. Unlike the other possessed animatronics, which retained some of their original vocal capabilities and could produce sounds that, however disturbing, remained recognizably connected to their programmed entertainment functions, Golden Freddy manifested in almost complete silence, its presence announced only by the sudden awareness that something had fundamentally changed in the observer's environment. This silence was not the simple absence of sound that might characterize a malfunctioning animatronic or a piece of equipment that had been powered down. Instead, Golden Freddy's silence seemed to possess its own weight and substance, creating an atmosphere of anticipation and dread that was far more unsettling than any sound the phantom might have produced. The entity's refusal or inability to speak created a sense that it was holding back something terrible, that its silence represented not emptiness, but the barely contained force of emotions too powerful to be expressed through normal means. Yet there were occasions when Golden Freddy did produce sounds, and these rare vocalizations were among the most disturbing aspects of encountering the phantom. Unlike the cheerful songs and programmed dialogue that characterized normal animatronic performances, the sounds that emerged from Golden Freddy seemed to come from somewhere far deeper and more primal than any entertainment system could access. The most commonly reported vocalization was a phrase that became associated specifically with Golden Freddy encounters. "It's me." These two simple words, when spoken by the phantom, carried within them a weight of meaning that far exceeded their literal content. The phrase seemed to serve simultaneously as identification, accusation, and promise, conveying the murdered child's continued existence, the injustice of their death, and their determination to ensure that their killer would eventually face consequences for his actions. The voice that delivered this phrase bore no resemblance to the cheerful, child-friendly tones that characterized normal animatronic speech patterns. Instead, it possessed a quality that seemed to exist somewhere between the voice of a murdered child and something far older and more terrible, as if the act of dying had transformed the victim's consciousness into something that transcended normal human emotional and vocal ranges. Witnesses who heard Golden Freddy speak reported that the phantom's voice seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an effect that made it impossible to determine exactly where the entity was positioned or how the sound was being produced. This omnidirectional quality suggested that Golden Freddy's vocalizations were not dependent on normal mechanical speakers or sound production systems, but rather emerged from the phantom's supernatural essence in ways that bypassed conventional understanding of acoustics and audio engineering. The timing of Golden Freddy's appearances seemed to follow patterns that were related more to emotional and psychological factors than to any predictable schedule or mechanical programming. The phantom was most likely to manifest during moments of high stress or guilt, particularly when individuals who were connected to the restaurant's tragic history found themselves alone and vulnerable to supernatural encounters. Night security guards, whose job duties required them to remain alone in the restaurant during the hours when supernatural activity was most pronounced, became the most frequent witnesses to Golden Freddy manifestations. These encounters typically occurred during the early morning hours, when the combination of fatigue, isolation, and the restaurant's disturbing history created conditions that seemed to facilitate supernatural phenomena. The guards reported that Golden Freddy encounters followed no predictable pattern, making it impossible to develop strategies for avoiding or managing the phantom's appearances. Unlike the other possessed animatronics, whose movements could be tracked through security cameras and whose behavior patterns could be learned through experience, Golden Freddy remained completely unpredictable in terms of when, where, and why it chose to manifest. This unpredictability was itself a form of psychological torture, as it prevented anyone from feeling truly secure within the restaurant's walls. The knowledge that Golden Freddy could appear anywhere at any time created a constant state of nervous anticipation that proved far more wearing than the more direct threats posed by the other haunted animatronics. Security guards learned to fear not just the phantom's presence, but also the possibility of its presence, understanding that any moment of inattention or relaxation could result in the sudden discovery that they were no longer alone. The phantom's behavior during these encounters varied depending on the individual being observed and their relationship to the events that had created Golden Freddy's supernatural existence. For most innocent witnesses, the entity remained motionless and silent, its golden eyes serving as the only indication that it was aware of their presence. These encounters, while deeply unsettling, typically concluded without any direct threat or aggressive action, as if Golden Freddy were merely observing and evaluating rather than preparing to attack. However, For individuals who bore some responsibility for or connection to the missing children incident, Golden Freddy's behavior took on a more actively threatening character. The Phantom would appear more frequently to such people, its manifestations occurring at moments calculated to produce maximum psychological distress. The golden eyes would track their movements with obvious malevolent intent, while the entity's presence seemed to carry with it an almost tangible aura of accusation and promised retribution. The most extreme Golden Freddy encounters involved what witnesses described as jump scares, sudden aggressive manifestations that seemed designed to produce intense fear and psychological trauma in their targets. These encounters typically began with the Phantom appearing in its characteristic slumped position, only to suddenly lunge forward or change position in ways that violated every expectation about how the entity normally behaved. These aggressive manifestations were accompanied by sounds that bore no resemblance to normal animatronic vocalizations, instead producing what could only be described as screams of rage and anguish that seemed to emerge from somewhere far beyond the physical world. The combination of sudden movement, terrifying sounds, and the Phantom's malevolent presence created experiences that left witnesses traumatized and, in some cases, physically ill from the intensity of their fear response. Yet even these most aggressive encounters seemed to follow rules that prevented Golden Freddy from causing direct physical harm to its targets. Unlike urban legends about supernatural entities that could injure or kill those who encountered them, Golden Freddy appeared to be limited to psychological and emotional effects, using fear and guilt as its primary weapons, rather than any form of direct violence. This limitation suggested that the Phantom retained some connection to the moral nature of the child whose spirit had created it, as if the murdered victim's essential goodness prevented Golden Freddy from becoming the same kind of monster that had destroyed the original 5 children. The entity sought justice and vengeance, but it pursued these goals through means that, while terrifying, remained fundamentally different from the physical violence that had created the need for such supernatural intervention. The comparative analysis between Golden Freddy and the other possessed animatronics revealed the extent to which the 5th child's supernatural manifestation differed from those of the other murder victims. While Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy retained clear connections to their mechanical bodies and operated according to rules that corresponded to their original programming, Golden Freddy existed in a state that seemed to transcend both mechanical and spiritual limitations. The other possessed animatronics moved through the restaurant in ways that respected the building's physical structure, using doors and hallways as living beings would, and remaining subject to at least some of the constraints that governed normal movement and positioning. Their supernatural abilities were impressive but remained grounded in extensions of their mechanical capabilities, as if the possessing spirits were working within and through the systems that had originally brought the animatronics to life. Golden Freddy's abilities, by contrast, seemed to operate independently of any mechanical system or physical constraint, suggesting that the 5th child's spirit had achieved a level of supernatural freedom that exceeded what the other victims had been able to accomplish. This difference might have reflected the unique circumstances of the 5th child's death, the resistance and fighting spirit that had marked their final moments, or simply individual differences in spiritual strength and determination that transcended physical death. The Phantom's relationship with the restaurant's other supernatural phenomena was complex and not fully understood by anyone who encountered these manifestations. Golden Freddy seemed to exist simultaneously as part of the collective haunting that affected Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and as something separate and distinct from the other possessed animatronics, pursuing its own agenda, while remaining connected to the shared trauma that had created all of these supernatural entities. This dual nature created situations where Golden Freddy's presence would influence the behavior of the other haunted animatronics, sometimes calming their aggressive tendencies, and other times seeming to amplify their supernatural abilities. The Phantom appeared to serve as both individual spirit and conductor of the collective haunting, coordinating the activities of all 5 murdered children in pursuit of goals that transcended what any single spirit could have accomplished alone. The office encounters that became most associated with Golden Freddy represented the Phantom's most direct and personal form of communication with the living world. Unlike the other possessed animatronics, whose presence in the security office typically preceded aggressive actions or jump scare attacks, Golden Freddy would simply appear and remain motionless, its presence serving as both message and threat to whoever discovered it there. These office manifestations seemed designed to create maximum psychological impact while demonstrating the Phantom's complete disregard for the security measures that were supposed to protect the night guards from supernatural encounters. The entity could appear inside the office, regardless of whether the doors were closed or open, whether the lights were on or off, and whether the security cameras showed any indication that something was approaching the guard's position. The discovery of Golden Freddy sitting motionless in the office chair created one of the most iconic and disturbing images associated with the restaurant's supernatural phenomena. The Phantom's slumped posture, glowing eyes, and complete silence combined to create an encounter that was simultaneously passive and intensely threatening, as if the mere presence of the entity carried within it all the accusation and promised retribution that more active supernatural manifestations might express through movement or sound. These office encounters typically concluded with Golden Freddy disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the lingering sense that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the Phantom and whoever had discovered it there. The entity's message, whatever it might have been, was delivered through presence rather than action, through the simple demonstration that no location within the restaurant could be considered safe from its supernatural influence. The cumulative effect of repeated Golden Freddy encounters was a level of psychological pressure that few individuals could withstand for extended periods. Unlike the other possessed animatronics, whose behavior patterns could eventually be learned and whose threats could be managed through appropriate security measures, Golden Freddy remained perpetually unpredictable and impossible to defend against through conventional means. Security guards who remained employed at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza for extended periods reported that encounters with Golden Freddy became increasingly frequent and intense over time, as if the Phantom were escalating its psychological campaign against anyone who dared to remain in the restaurant during the hours when supernatural activity was most pronounced. The entity seemed capable of learning from each encounter, adapting its manifestation methods to produce maximum psychological impact based on individual fears and vulnerabilities. This escalating pattern of supernatural harassment suggested that Golden Freddy's ultimate goal was not simply to frighten or intimidate, but rather to drive away anyone who might interfere with its primary mission of pursuing justice against William Afton. The Phantom's encounters with innocent employees and security guards served as both reconnaissance and psychological warfare, gathering information about potential obstacles, while demonstrating the futility of any attempts to maintain normal operations in a location that had become the focal point of such intense supernatural activity. The golden-eyed phantom that emerged from the tragedy of the missing children incident represented something unprecedented in the annals of supernatural phenomena, an entity that existed according to its own rules, while pursuing a mission of justice that transcended normal understanding of how the spirits of murder victims might seek resolution for the wrongs committed against them. Golden Freddy had become both individual consciousness and collective force, both victim seeking peace and avenger demanding retribution, existing in the liminal space between worlds while serving as a constant reminder that some crimes create consequences that extend far beyond the physical realm into dimensions where normal human understanding provides no guidance or comfort. The mystery of Golden Freddy's true nature extends beyond the simple question of which spirit inhabits the phantom form, reaching into the complex realm of dual consciousness and shared supernatural existence that challenges every conventional understanding of how death, memory, and spiritual persistence interact within the boundaries of a single manifestation. To comprehend the golden phantom that haunts Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, one must first understand that Golden Freddy represents not one murdered child seeking justice, but rather the convergence of two separate tragedies that have become intertwined through circumstances of pain, guilt, and the supernatural forces that emerge when innocent blood is spilled in places meant to harbor only joy. The first soul bound to the Golden Freddy entity traces its origins back to the original Fredbear's Family Diner, and the terrible accident that claimed William Afton's youngest son during what should have been a celebration of another year of life. This child, known to those who loved him as the crying child, due to his sensitive nature and frequent tears over fears that others could not see or understand, had developed a relationship with the golden bear that transcended normal childhood attachment to toys or entertainment figures. The crying child's connection to Fredbear was complex and contradictory, marked by both deep affection and paralyzing terror that seemed to exist simultaneously within his young psyche. He would speak to the animatronic as if it were a living friend, engaging in conversations that appeared one-sided to adult observers, but which the child seemed to experience as genuine exchanges of communication and understanding. Yet the same golden bear that served as his confidant also became the source of nightmares that left him screaming in his sleep and refusing to approach the restaurant's main performance area. This paradoxical relationship between love and fear created a spiritual bond that death could not entirely sever, a connection so profound that it transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the departed. When the spring lock mechanisms failed and Fredbear's mechanical jaws closed with devastating force, the trauma of that moment created more than just physical destruction. It forged a supernatural link between the dying child and the machine that had become both his greatest comfort and his ultimate destroyer. The crying child's death was not instantaneous, unlike the quick violence that would later claim the 5 children murdered by his father. Instead, he lingered for days in a hospital bed, while his consciousness drifted between the world of the living and whatever realm awaited beyond death. During this liminal period, his spirit remained partially attached to the physical world, unwilling or unable to fully depart from a life that had been cut short by circumstances beyond his understanding or control. The child's final moments were marked not by anger or desire for vengeance, but by confusion and sorrow over the way his young life had ended. He could not comprehend why the golden bear he had loved and feared in equal measure had become the instrument of his destruction, nor could he understand why his brother's cruel prank had resulted in consequences so far beyond what anyone had intended. His spirit, when it finally separated from his dying body, carried with it not hatred, but a profound sense of incompletion and loss. This gentle, confused spirit found itself drawn back to the place where its life had ended, not by any desire for revenge, but by the simple inability to move forward from trauma so severe that it had fractured the normal process of death and spiritual departure. The crying child's essence became bound to Fredbear not as a possessing force seeking to use the animatronic for aggressive purposes, but as a consciousness that could not separate itself from the final moments of its physical existence. The manifestation of this first spiritual presence was markedly different from the vengeful haunting that would later emerge from William Afton's murders. The crying child's influence on Fredbear was subtle and melancholy, creating supernatural phenomena that reflected confusion and sadness rather than anger or malice. Staff members at locations where Fredbear operated reported hearing what sounded like quiet weeping coming from the animatronic during hours when no children were present, while others noticed that the golden bear's movements sometimes seemed hesitant and uncertain, as if something was interfering with its normal programming. Yet the crying child's spiritual presence was not strong enough to create the kind of dramatic, supernatural manifestations that would later become associated with the Golden Freddy phenomenon. The boy's gentle nature and his lack of understanding about what had happened to him prevented his spirit from achieving the focused intensity necessary for powerful paranormal activity. He existed as a quiet, confused presence that influenced Fredbear's behavior in subtle ways, but lacked the emotional force necessary to bend reality to his will. This changed dramatically with the arrival of the second soul, the 5th child murdered by William Afton during the missing children incident of 1985. Unlike the crying child, whose death had been accidental and whose spirit remained gentle despite its traumatic circumstances, this second consciousness had been forged in deliberate violence and shaped by experiences that transformed natural childhood innocence into something far more focused and determined. The 5th murdered child, later identified as Cassidy through evidence that emerged years after the crimes were committed, possessed a personality that was fundamentally different from that of the crying child. Where William's son had been sensitive and fearful, prone to tears and easily overwhelmed by situations he could not control, Cassidy demonstrated a strength of will and determination that seemed almost adult in its intensity despite being housed in such a young form. This strength manifested most clearly during Cassidy's final encounter with William Afton in the back rooms of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, when the child refused to submit quietly to the fate that had befallen the previous 4 victims. Unlike the other murdered children, who had been overwhelmed by the adult's size and authority and the shocking nature of what was happening to them, Cassidy fought back with a ferocity that surprised even the experienced predator who had lured them away from safety. The struggle that ensued was different from William's previous crimes, marked by resistance that forced him to use more violence than he had employed against the other children. Cassidy's determination to survive, to escape, to somehow turn the tables on their attacker, created a dynamic that was absent from the earlier murders. The child's final moments were characterized not by confusion or terror, but by a burning rage against the injustice being perpetrated against them and their fellow victims. This rage survived physical death and became the driving force behind Cassidy's spiritual manifestation, creating a consciousness that possessed both the focus and the emotional intensity necessary for powerful supernatural activity. Unlike the crying child, whose gentle nature prevented him from achieving dramatic paranormal effects, Cassidy's anger provided the fuel for manifestations that could bend reality itself to serve the cause of justice and vengeance. The convergence of these 2 very different spiritual presences within the same supernatural entity created the complex phenomenon known as Golden Freddy. The phantom that emerged from this dual consciousness possessed characteristics drawn from both constituent souls, combining the crying child's deep connection to the Fredbear character with Cassidy's powerful emotional intensity and focused determination to pursue justice against William Afton. This merger was not a simple addition of 2 separate consciousnesses, but rather a complex fusion that created something entirely new while retaining elements of both original personalities. The resulting entity possessed abilities that exceeded what either spirit could have achieved alone, drawing strength from the crying child's intimate connection to the golden bear form and direction from Cassidy's unwavering focus on confronting the man responsible for both of their deaths. The dual nature of Golden Freddy's consciousness explained many of the contradictions and inconsistencies that characterized the Phantom's behavior over the decades following the missing children incident. The entity would sometimes manifest with the confused, melancholy characteristics associated with the crying child's spiritual presence, appearing sad and lost rather than threatening or aggressive. At other times, Golden Freddy would display the focused malevolence that reflected Cassidy's determination to pursue vengeance against William Afton, its golden eyes burning with an intensity that promised terrible consequences for those who had committed crimes against innocent children. The crying child's influence on Golden Freddy was most apparent in the Phantom's characteristic slumped posture, which reflected the boy's natural tendency towards sadness and defeat in the face of overwhelming circumstances. This collapsed positioning was not simply a mechanical malfunction or artistic choice, but rather a physical manifestation of the crying child's spiritual state, his consciousness still marked by the confusion and sorrow that had characterized his final days of life. The gentle nature that had defined the crying child in life also influenced Golden Freddy's behavior toward innocent individuals who encountered the Phantom during their work at various Freddy Fazbear locations. While the entity was certainly capable of frightening such people, these encounters typically concluded without any real harm being inflicted, as if the crying child's essential goodness prevented Golden Freddy from becoming truly dangerous to those who bore no responsibility for the crimes that had created the haunting. Cassidy's influence, by contrast, was most visible in Golden Freddy's interactions with William Afton and others who were connected to the murders that had claimed 5 innocent lives. The Phantom's ability to appear anywhere at any time, to manifest with devastating psychological impact, and to pursue its targets with relentless determination reflected the strength of will and focused anger that had characterized Cassidy's resistance during their final moments of life. The phrase, "It's me," that became so closely associated with Golden Freddy. Encounters carried different meanings, depending on which consciousness was dominant during any particular manifestation. When influenced primarily by the crying child's spirit, the phrase seemed to represent a confused attempt at identification and communication, as if the boy were trying to remind his father of their relationship and his continued existence despite physical death. When Cassidy's consciousness took precedence, the same words became an accusation and a promise, a declaration that the murdered child's spirit had not forgotten the crimes committed against them and would never stop pursuing justice. The nightmare realm that manifested around the crying child's experiences represented another aspect of the dual consciousness that inhabited Golden Freddy. The terrifying visions of monstrous animatronics that plagued the boy's dreams before his death continued to exist in supernatural form after his spirit became part of the Golden Freddy entity, creating a parallel dimension of fear and confusion that reflected his unresolved trauma. These nightmares were not simply random manifestations of supernatural energy, but rather carefully constructed psychological landscapes that drew their power from the crying child's deepest fears and most vivid traumatic memories. The nightmare animatronics that inhabited this realm were twisted versions of the characters that had both entertained and terrified the boy during his life. Their monstrous appearances, reflecting the way his young mind had processed the complex emotions surrounding his relationship with Fredbear and the other mechanical performers. The bedroom that served as the focal point of these nightmare encounters was a perfect recreation of the crying child's actual room, down to the smallest details of furniture arrangement and personal belongings. This precise duplication suggested that the nightmare realm was not simply a product of random supernatural forces, but rather a deliberate construction created by the boy's spirit as a way of processing and attempting to understand the trauma that had claimed his life. Fredbear's role within this nightmare dimension was particularly significant, as the golden bear appeared not as the beloved friend the crying child had known, but as a monstrous representation of betrayal and broken trust. Nightmare Fredbear embodied all of the boy's confused feelings about the animatronic that had served as both protector and destroyer, friend and executioner, comfort and source of ultimate terror. The nightmare realm's connection to the physical world remained tenuous and inconsistent, manifesting most clearly during periods when the Golden Freddy entity was particularly active, or when individuals connected to the Afton family found themselves in psychologically vulnerable states. The nightmares served as both punishment and communication, forcing their victims to experience something approximating the fear and confusion that had characterized the crying child's final days, while also demonstrating the continued existence and influence of his spiritual presence. Cassidy's contribution to the Golden Freddy phenomenon extended beyond simple anger and determination, encompassing a sophisticated understanding of justice and retribution that seemed far beyond what any child should possess. This supernatural wisdom appeared to be a product of the circumstances surrounding Cassidy's death, as if the experience of being murdered had somehow expanded the child's consciousness to encompass concepts and motivations that transcended normal childhood emotional development. The strategic nature of Golden Freddy's manifestations reflected this enhanced understanding, as the Phantom appeared to coordinate its activities with those of the other possessed animatronics in pursuit of goals that required careful planning and precise timing. Cassidy's influence provided the intellectual framework necessary for such coordination, transforming what might have been random supernatural outbursts into focused campaigns designed to achieve specific objectives. The Phantom's ability to appear in multiple locations simultaneously, or to manifest in ways that defied physical laws, drew its power from both constituent consciousnesses working in harmony. The crying child's intimate connection to the Fredbear character provided the spiritual anchor necessary for manifestation, while Cassidy's determination supplied the emotional energy required to bend reality according to their shared will. This cooperation between the two souls was not always smooth or consistent, as their very different personalities and motivations sometimes created internal conflicts that manifested as inconsistencies in Golden Freddy's behavior. The entity might begin an encounter displaying the confused sadness associated with the crying child's influence, only to suddenly shift to the focused malevolence that characterized Cassidy's spiritual presence, creating manifestations that seemed to change personality mid-encounter. The resolution of these internal conflicts typically favored Cassidy's stronger will and clearer sense of purpose, as the murdered child's determination to pursue justice provided a more focused direction for the entity's supernatural activities. Yet the crying child's influence never disappeared entirely, serving as a moderating force that prevented Golden Freddy from becoming as directly violent or destructive as it might have been if powered by Cassidy's rage alone. The relationship between the two souls that inhabited Golden Freddy reflected broader themes of family, responsibility, and the way trauma can bind individuals together across the boundaries between life and death. The crying child and Cassidy had never met during their physical lives, coming from different time periods and completely different circumstances, yet their shared connection to the Afton family tragedies had forged a spiritual partnership that transcended normal understanding of individual identity and personal consciousness. The crying child's presence within Golden Freddy served as a constant reminder to Cassidy of the broader context surrounding William Afton's crimes, demonstrating that the man's capacity for causing pain and destruction extended beyond his deliberate murders to encompass the accidental tragedy that had claimed his own son. This awareness seemed to intensify Cassidy's determination to ensure that William faced consequences for all of his actions, both intentional and inadvertent. Conversely, Cassidy's strength and focus provided the crying child's confused spirit with direction and purpose that it had lacked since the moment of death. The murdered child's clear understanding of right and wrong, justice and injustice, gave the crying child's gentle nature a framework within which to operate, transforming confused sadness into purposeful melancholy that could contribute meaningfully to their shared mission. The dual consciousness that defined Golden Freddy's existence created a supernatural entity that was both more and less than the sum of its parts, possessing abilities that neither individual soul could have achieved alone, while also being constrained by the need to balance very different personalities and motivations. This complex internal dynamic was reflected in every aspect of the Phantom's manifestations, from the inconsistencies in its behavior to the unique characteristics that set it apart from all other supernatural phenomena associated with the Freddy Fazbear franchise. The golden coloration that gave the Phantom its name carried symbolic significance that drew meaning from both constituent consciousness, representing the precious nature of innocent life that had been destroyed through William Afton's actions, while also reflecting the value of the justice and retribution that the entity sought to achieve. The sickly, faded quality of this golden hue suggested that such innocence, once destroyed, could never be fully restored, no matter how complete any eventual justice might prove to be. The slumped posture that characterized Golden Freddy's physical manifestations embodied the weight of trauma carried by both souls, the crying child's confusion and sadness combining with Cassidy's burden of representing all 5 murdered children in their quest for justice. This collapsed positioning was not a sign of defeat or surrender, but rather a physical representation of the enormous emotional and spiritual weight that the entity bore on behalf of all the innocent victims whose lives had been cut short by William Afton's predatory actions. The glowing eyes that served as Golden Freddy's most distinctive feature burned with the combined intensity of 2 consciousnesses that had experienced the ultimate violation of childhood innocence and trust. Their golden fire, reflecting both the gentle sorrow of accidental tragedy and the focused rage of deliberate murder. These eyes served as windows into a dual soul that had been forged in pain but had chosen to use that pain as fuel for a mission that transcended personal vengeance to become something approaching divine justice. The mystery of Golden Freddy's true nature could only be understood through recognition of this dual consciousness and the way 2 very different spiritual presences had merged to create something entirely unprecedented in the annals of supernatural phenomena. The phantom that haunted Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was neither simply the crying child, nor simply Cassidy, but rather a new form of existence that incorporated elements of both while transcending the limitations that had constrained each individual soul. This transcendence was not without cost, as the merger of 2 consciousnesses had created internal tensions and contradictions that would influence Golden Freddy's behavior for decades to come. The entity's struggle to balance the competing demands of its constituent souls would become one of the defining characteristics of the haunting, creating manifestations that were simultaneously gentle and terrifying, confused and focused, sorrowful and enraged. Yet within this complexity lay the true power of the Golden Freddy phenomenon, a supernatural presence that could draw strength from multiple sources of motivation while pursuing justice on behalf of all the innocent victims whose lives had been destroyed by William Afton's transformation from grieving father to predatory monster. The golden phantom that emerged from the convergence of two traumatized souls would prove to possess both the emotional intensity and the spiritual resilience necessary to pursue its mission across generations, ensuring that the crimes committed against innocent children would never be forgotten or forgiven until proper justice had been achieved. Among the 5 children whose lives were stolen in the shadows of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza during that terrible summer of 1985, one soul burned brighter and more furiously than all the others, a consciousness that refused to accept the finality of death and transformed the injustice of murder into a supernatural force capable of reaching across decades to claim the retribution that earthly justice had failed to provide. This was Cassidy, the 5th and final victim of William Afton's predatory rampage, whose spirit would prove to possess a strength and determination that transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. The identity of this remarkable child remained hidden for years behind the clinical designation of the 5th victim, a bureaucratic label that reduced a complex human being to nothing more than a number in a case file that would eventually be closed without resolution. Law enforcement investigators, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the missing children incident and frustrated by their inability to locate bodies or identify a suspect, found it easier to discuss their failure in terms of statistics rather than individuals, referring to 5 missing children rather than Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and the unknown 5th whose names seemed to have been deliberately erased from all official records. This anonymity was not accidental, but rather the result of William Afton's particular attention to ensuring that his final victim would be difficult to identify and investigate. Unlike the previous 4 children, whose disappearances had been reported promptly by families who were actively engaged in their lives and aware of their whereabouts, Cassidy had been selected specifically because her circumstances made her a less likely candidate for immediate police attention and media coverage. The child came from a broken home where parental supervision was inconsistent and emotional support was largely absent, creating conditions that made her both vulnerable to predatory attention and less likely to be missed during the crucial first hours following her disappearance. Her family situation was complicated by divorce proceedings, custody disputes, and the kind of adult conflicts that often leave children feeling invisible and unprotected in their own homes. Yet, despite these difficult circumstances, or perhaps because of them, Cassidy had developed an inner strength and self-reliance that set her apart from other children her age. She possessed an acute awareness of adult motivations and behaviors that came from being forced to navigate complex family dynamics without adequate protection or guidance. This premature wisdom made her more suspicious of strangers and less trusting of authority figures than the previous victims had been, qualities that would prove both protective and ultimately insufficient in the face of William Afton's calculated predation. When Cassidy encountered the man in the spring Bonnie costume in the back areas of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, her initial reaction was skeptical rather than enthusiastic. Unlike the other children, who had been drawn to the costumed figure by excitement and curiosity about meeting what appeared to be a special performer, Cassidy approached the encounter with wariness that reflected her hard-earned understanding that adults were not always trustworthy and that situations that seemed too good to be true usually were. William Afton was forced to work harder to gain Cassidy's trust than he had with any of his previous victims, employing more sophisticated manipulation techniques and investing more time in breaking down her natural defenses. The conversation that preceded the actual crime was longer and more complex than those associated with the earlier murders, as Cassidy asked pointed questions and demanded explanations that the other children had not thought to request. This resistance should have served as a warning that Cassidy would prove to be a more challenging victim than William had anticipated, but his confidence in his methods and his growing addiction to the sense of power that came from successfully deceiving and controlling children prevented him from recognizing the danger signals that a more cautious predator might have heeded. He interpreted her questions and skepticism as mere obstacles to overcome rather than indicators of a strength that would prove to have consequences extending far beyond the physical confrontation that was about to unfold. When William finally revealed his true intentions and attempted to subdue Cassidy through the same combination of physical intimidation and psychological manipulation that had proven effective against the previous victims, he encountered resistance that caught him completely off guard. Instead of freezing with terror or attempting to flee in panic, Cassidy fought back with a ferocity that seemed to draw strength from some deep reservoir of rage and determination. The struggle that followed was unlike anything William had experienced during his previous crimes, marked by a level of violence that forced him to abandon the careful methods he had developed for ensuring that his victims remained quiet and compliant. Cassidy's refusal to submit without a fight created a dynamic that was both dangerous and personally enraging to a man who had grown accustomed to complete control over his chosen targets. The child's resistance was not limited to physical fighting, but extended to verbal defiance that demonstrated an understanding of what was happening that exceeded what any child should have possessed. Cassidy seemed to recognize not only that she was in mortal danger, but also that William was responsible for the disappearances of the other children, displaying an awareness that suggested she had been paying attention to details and patterns that adults had missed or ignored. This knowledge transformed Cassidy from simple victim to witness and accuser, a role that William found intolerable, given his need to maintain the fiction that his crimes were isolated incidents rather than part of a systematic campaign of predation. The child's accusations and threats to reveal what she had discovered added psychological pressure to what was already becoming the most difficult and dangerous encounter of William's criminal career. The final moments of Cassidy's life were characterized by a determination that seemed to transcend normal human emotional responses to mortal threat, as if her consciousness had already begun the transformation that would allow her spirit to persist beyond physical death. Even as William's superior size and strength began to overwhelm her resistance, she continued to fight with an intensity that seemed to draw power from sources beyond mere physical adrenaline and survival instinct. Her last words, spoken with a clarity and force that cut through the chaos of their struggle, were not pleas for mercy or cries of terror, but rather a promise that her death would not be the end of their conflict. The specific phrasing of this promise was lost to history, known only to William himself, but its meaning was unmistakable. This was a child who refused to accept defeat even in the face of certain death, whose spirit was already preparing to continue the fight from whatever realm awaited beyond the boundary between life and death. William Afton emerged from his encounter with Cassidy, fundamentally changed by the experience, shaken by the level of resistance he had encountered and disturbed by the child's final words in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Unlike his previous victims, whose deaths had provided him with a sense of power and control that fed his growing psychological addiction to violence, Cassidy's murder left him feeling unsettled and vaguely threatened, as if he had won a battle while somehow losing a larger war. The immediate aftermath of the crime followed the same pattern William had established with the previous victims, as Cassidy's body was concealed within the restaurant's structure in a location that would prevent its discovery during any routine investigation. Yet even this familiar process felt different, marked by an urgency and nervousness that reflected William's unconscious awareness that this particular victim might prove to be different from the others in ways that extended beyond her unusual resistance. The spiritual transformation that began at the moment of Cassidy's death was unlike the gradual manifestation of supernatural presence that had characterized the other murdered children's posthumous existence, where Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz had required time to adjust to their new state of being and learn how to influence the physical world through their connection to the animatronic characters. Cassidy's consciousness seemed to achieve immediate and complete mastery over supernatural forces that allowed her to transcend normal spiritual limitations. This rapid development of paranormal abilities reflected both the intensity of emotion that had marked Cassidy's death and her fundamental unwillingness to accept the finality of physical mortality when there was still work to be done in pursuing justice against the man who had destroyed not only her own life, but also those of 4 other innocent children. Her spirit possessed a focus and determination that transformed grief and rage into supernatural power of unprecedented magnitude. The manifestation of this power initially took the form of the Golden Freddy entity, though Cassidy's consciousness was not limited to any single form or location in the way that characterized the other possessed animatronics. Her spiritual presence seemed to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions and locations, capable of influencing events throughout the Freddy Fazbear franchise, while maintaining its primary focus on the systematic torment of William Afton. The phrase that became most closely associated with Cassidy's supernatural manifestations, "the one you should not have killed," represented both identification and accusation, serving notice to William that his final victim had become something far more dangerous than he could have imagined when he first encountered the suspicious child in the back rooms of his family restaurant. This was not merely another ghost seeking rest or peace, but rather a force of supernatural justice that would pursue its target with relentless determination across decades and through whatever transformations death and time might bring. The choice of this particular phrase reflected Cassidy's understanding that she was different from the other victims, not because her life had been more valuable or her death more tragic, but because she alone possessed the strength and determination necessary to serve as the instrument of justice for all 5 murdered children. She had become their representative and champion, speaking not only for herself but for Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz, whose gentler spirits lacked the focused rage necessary to achieve meaningful retribution. This representative role was not imposed upon Cassidy by external forces, but rather emerged from her own sense of responsibility and justice, qualities that had been strengthened rather than diminished by the trauma of her death. She understood that the other children's spirits, while capable of achieving limited supernatural manifestations through their connection to the possessed animatronics, lacked both the power and the ruthless determination necessary to ensure that William Afton would face appropriate consequences for his crimes. The development of what would eventually become known as Ultimate Custom Night represented Cassidy's most sophisticated and comprehensive approach to achieving the justice that had been denied through conventional means. This supernatural construct was not simply a random collection of terrifying experiences designed to frighten or punish, but rather a carefully crafted psychological prison specifically designed to exploit William Afton's particular fears and vulnerabilities, while ensuring that he could never escape or find peace. The creation of such a complex supernatural environment required abilities that far exceeded anything the other possessed animatronics had demonstrated, suggesting that Cassidy's spiritual transformation had achieved something approaching divine levels of power and understanding. The Ultimate Custom Night was not merely a haunting, but rather an entirely separate dimension of existence, a realm where normal rules of physics and causality could be suspended or modified to serve the cause of justice. Within this supernatural prison, Cassidy was able to manifest not only her own consciousness but also representations of all the other spirits that had been affected by William's crimes, creating a comprehensive confrontation that forced him to face the full scope of his responsibility for the suffering he had caused. The various animatronic characters that populated this nightmare realm were not simply random threats, but carefully chosen symbols of specific aspects of William's guilt and the different ways his actions had violated the trust and innocence of childhood. The Ultimate Custom Night served multiple purposes beyond simple punishment, functioning also as a form of cosmic justice that balanced the scales of right and wrong in ways that earthly legal systems had failed to achieve. William's imprisonment within this supernatural realm prevented him from causing additional harm to innocent children, while also ensuring that he experienced something approximating the terror and helplessness that his victims had felt during their final moments. Yet the most significant aspect of the Ultimate Custom Night was not its function as punishment, but rather its demonstration of Cassidy's evolved understanding of justice and responsibility. The child who had died fighting against impossible odds had become something that transcended normal concepts of victim and avenger, emerging as a force of cosmic balance that sought not mere revenge but true justice that addressed the full scope of harm caused by William's actions. This evolution, from victim to judge, represented a spiritual transformation that challenged normal understanding of how consciousness and personality persist beyond physical death. Cassidy's spirit had not simply retained its original characteristics, but had grown and developed in response to the unique circumstances of her supernatural existence, acquiring wisdom and perspective that seemed far beyond what any child should possess. The weight of responsibility that Cassidy bore as the representative of all 5 murdered children was reflected in her refusal to accept the peaceful resolution that the other spirits eventually found. While Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, and Fritz were able to find some measure of peace through the happiest day ceremony that symbolically restored the childhood innocence that had been stolen from them, Cassidy's consciousness remained focused on her mission of ensuring that justice was fully achieved. This refusal to move on was not based on simple vindictiveness or inability to forgive, but rather on a sophisticated understanding that true justice required more than symbolic gestures or momentary punishment. Cassidy's spirit recognized that William Afton's crimes had created ripples of harm that extended far beyond the immediate victims, affecting families, communities, and future generations in ways that demanded comprehensive rather than limited resolution. The spiritual strength that allowed Cassidy to maintain her focus on justice across decades of supernatural existence was fed by her connection to the other murdered children, whose spirits provided both moral support and additional power for the complex supernatural operations required to maintain the Ultimate Custom Night. This connection was not parasitic or exploitative, but rather represented a voluntary alliance between souls who shared a common cause and understood that their individual chances for justice were enhanced through cooperation. The phrase, "the one you should not have killed," carried within it an implicit acknowledgement that all 5 children had been equally innocent and equally deserving of protection, but that Cassidy alone possessed the specific combination of spiritual strength and moral determination necessary to serve as the instrument of their collective justice. This was not a claim of superiority, but rather an acceptance of responsibility that reflected her understanding of the unique role she was capable of filling. The interaction between Cassidy's consciousness and that of the crying child within the Golden Freddy entity created additional complexity in her pursuit of justice, as she found herself serving not only as representative of the 5 murdered children, but also as companion and guide to William's own son, whose accidental death had been the first tragedy in the chain of events that led to the missing children incident. This relationship with the crying child added layers of irony and moral complexity to Cassidy's mission, as she pursued justice against a man whose own grief and rage over the loss of his son had been the catalyst for his transformation into a child murderer. The presence of William's son within the Golden Freddy entity served as a constant reminder that the cycle of violence and retribution had claimed victims on both sides of the fundamental moral divide. Yet rather than weakening her resolve or creating sympathy for William's original loss, the crying child's presence seemed to strengthen Cassidy's determination to ensure that justice was achieved in a way that honored all of the innocent victims, rather than perpetuating the cycle of violence that had claimed so many young lives. Her relationship with William's son demonstrated that true justice required transcending personal vendettas to achieve resolution that served the greater good. The evolution of Cassidy's consciousness from murdered child to supernatural force of justice represented one of the most complex and sophisticated spiritual transformations documented in the annals of paranormal phenomena. Her ability to maintain focus and determination across decades of existence while growing in wisdom and power suggested that some souls possess qualities that allow them to transcend normal limitations of human consciousness and achieve something approaching divine understanding of justice and moral responsibility. The legacy of Cassidy's transformation would extend far beyond her personal pursuit of justice against William Afton, establishing precedents for how powerful spiritual forces could emerge from circumstances of extreme injustice and work to restore balance to situations where conventional means of resolution had failed. Her example demonstrated that the victims of terrible crimes were not powerless to seek redress, even when earthly institutions failed to provide adequate protection or punishment. The phrase that defined Cassidy's supernatural mission would become a rallying cry for justice that transcended the specific circumstances of the missing children incident, representing the voice of all victims who had been failed by systems that were supposed to protect them. The one you should not have killed spoke to universal principles of justice and moral responsibility that extended far beyond the confines of any single tragedy or location. Yet for all its cosmic significance and universal application, Cassidy's mission remained grounded in the specific reality of 5 children whose lives had been stolen by a predator who exploited their trust and innocence for his own twisted purposes. Her pursuit of justice was not abstract philosophical exercise, but rather deeply personal crusade to ensure that William Afton faced consequences proportional to the harm he had caused, and that future children would be protected from similar predation. The determination that had marked Cassidy's resistance during her final moments continued to burn within her spiritual consciousness, transformed by death into supernatural power, but retaining its essential character as refusal to accept injustice or surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. She had become the embodiment of righteous anger, channeled into constructive action, proof that even the most terrible circumstances could not extinguish the human capacity for moral courage and determination to fight for what was right. The mystery of Golden Freddy could only be fully understood through recognition of Cassidy's central role as the one you should not have killed, the spiritual force that transformed a collection of individual tragedies into a coordinated campaign for justice that would span generations. Her consciousness served as both engine and guide for supernatural activities that went far beyond simple haunting, to become something approaching divine intervention in affairs where human institutions had failed to provide adequate resolution. In the golden eyes that burned with supernatural intensity, in the slumped posture that bore the weight of multiple tragedies, and in the phantom presence that transcended normal limitations of time and space, Cassidy's spiritual essence continued to pursue the justice that had been denied in life, ensuring that the crimes against innocent children would never be forgotten or forgiven until proper retribution had been achieved. and future generations had been protected from similar horrors. The manifestation of Golden Freddy across the various iterations of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza represented a supernatural constant that persisted through decades of franchise changes, corporate restructuring, and technological advancement, demonstrating that some spiritual forces transcend the physical boundaries and temporal limitations that normally constrain paranormal phenomena. Each location, each era, each attempt to move beyond the tragedies of the past would find itself confronted by the Golden Phantom, whose very existence served as an immutable reminder that certain crimes create consequences that cannot be escaped through simple relocation or rebranding. The first documented encounter with Golden Freddy occurred during the early 1990s at what would retrospectively become known as the classic Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, the restaurant that represented the franchise's attempt to distance itself from the missing children incident while maintaining the profitable entertainment model that had made the brand successful. This establishment featured updated animatronic technology and enhanced security measures designed to prevent future tragedies. Yet, it would prove that no amount of technological sophistication could protect against supernatural forces that operated according to rules that bore no resemblance to mechanical programming or electronic surveillance. The night security guards employed at this location were the first to report encounters with an entity that defied every assumption about how the possessed animatronics were supposed to behave. Unlike Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, whose movements could be tracked through security cameras, and whose behavior patterns could eventually be predicted and managed, Golden Freddy appeared without warning in locations where no animatronic should have been able to travel, manifesting with a suddenness that left witnesses questioning their own perceptions of reality. The Phantom's signature manifestation involved appearing directly in the security office itself, a location that should have been completely inaccessible to any of the animatronic performers, regardless of their operational status or supernatural influence. Guards would return from brief checks of other monitors or simple moments of inattention to find Golden Freddy sitting motionless in the office chair, the entity's golden form slumped forward in its characteristic posture of defeat or exhaustion, while its glowing eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to see directly into the observer's soul. These office encounters were accompanied by complete system failures that suggested Golden Freddy's presence interfered with electronic equipment in ways that exceeded the normal electromagnetic effects associated with standard animatronic operation. Security cameras would display static or go completely dark, while audio systems produced sounds that bore no resemblance to programmed entertainment, content, or even the mechanical noises associated with animatronic movement and operation. The phrase, "It's me," became inextricably linked with these early Golden Freddy manifestations, though witnesses reported that the words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, creating an omnidirectional audio effect that made it impossible to determine whether the voice was being produced by Golden Freddy itself or emerging from some other supernatural source. The phrase carried within it layers of meaning that extended far beyond simple identification, serving simultaneously as accusation, reminder, and promise of consequences yet to come. The psychological impact of these encounters proved devastating for the individuals who experienced them, with many night security guards quitting their positions after single shifts that included Golden Freddy manifestations. Those who remained long enough to experience multiple encounters reported that the Phantom's appearances became increasingly intense and personally targeted, as if the entity was studying their responses and adapting its manifestation methods to produce maximum psychological distress. The mystery deepened with the discovery that Golden Freddy's presence could not be documented through conventional recording equipment, despite the Phantom's obvious visual presence during direct observation. Security cameras that should have captured clear images of the entity instead showed empty chairs or recorded nothing but static during the precise moments when guards reported direct visual contact with the golden figure. This inability to create permanent records of the encounters added an additional layer of psychological uncertainty, as witnesses found themselves unable to prove that their experiences had been real rather than products of stress-induced hallucination or imagination. Yet, the consistency of reports from multiple independent witnesses established patterns that confirmed Golden Freddy's objective existence rather than subjective delusion. Guards who had no contact with their predecessors described identical encounters, complete with specific details about the phantom's appearance, behavior, and the accompanying system failures that characterized its manifestations. The accumulation of testimony from credible witnesses created a body of evidence that could not be dismissed as mere folklore or occupational legend. The transition to the 1987 Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location brought with it new animatronic technology and updated security systems, yet these technological improvements proved entirely ineffective against Golden Freddy's supernatural abilities. If anything, the Phantom's manifestations became more frequent and intense at this newer facility, as if the attempt to modernize and sanitize the franchise's image had somehow provoked increased supernatural activity. The withered Golden Freddy that manifested at this location displayed visual characteristics that reflected the passage of time and the cumulative weight of unresolved spiritual trauma. Unlike the relatively intact appearance that had characterized earlier manifestations, this version of the Phantom showed clear signs of deterioration and damage that seemed to mirror the psychological wear experienced by consciousness that had been pursuing justice for nearly a decade without achieving meaningful resolution. The withered appearance was not simply aesthetic degradation, but rather represented the physical manifestation of spiritual exhaustion and growing desperation. As Cassidy's consciousness began to confront the possibility that conventional haunting methods might prove insufficient to achieve the justice she sought, the damaged golden fur and exposed mechanical components visible in this iteration of Golden Freddy served as external representations of internal struggle and the toll that prolonged supernatural existence was taking on even the most determined spiritual consciousness. Yet this apparent weakening was deceptive, as the withered Golden Freddy proved to possess enhanced abilities that far exceeded those demonstrated by the earlier manifestation. The Phantom could now appear in multiple locations simultaneously, creating encounters that suggested the entity had somehow learned to fragment its consciousness across different dimensional spaces, while maintaining coherent awareness and purposeful behavior in each manifestation. The security office encounters at the 1987 location were characterized by increased aggression and more direct threats than had been documented previously, as if Golden Freddy's patience was beginning to wear thin after years of pursuing justice through subtle psychological pressure. Guards reported that the Phantom's appearances were now accompanied by more intense system failures and more disturbing audio phenomena, including sounds that seemed designed to recreate the final moments of the murdered children's lives. The phrase, "It's me," evolved into longer and more complex vocalizations that provided glimpses into the collective consciousness that drove Golden Freddy's supernatural activities. Witnesses reported hearing multiple voices speaking in unison, suggesting that the Phantom served not only as individual spirit, but as representative of all 5 murdered children whose deaths remained unavenged through conventional justice systems. The most significant development during this period was Golden Freddy's apparent awareness of and interest in the new child victims created by the Bite of 87, an incident that demonstrated William Afton's continued capacity for causing harm, even when he was no longer directly involved in restaurant operations. The Phantom's increased activity following this new tragedy suggested that its mission had expanded beyond seeking justice for the original 5 victims to encompass protection of all children who might be endangered by the systemic failures that had allowed such tragedies to occur. Repeatedly, the temporary closure of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza following the bite of 87 did nothing to diminish Golden Freddy's supernatural presence, as security personnel assigned to monitor the abandoned facility reported continued encounters with the Phantom during the months when the restaurant remained officially closed to the public. These manifestations occurred with such frequency and intensity that the building's corporate owners were eventually forced to acknowledge that their property had become the focal point of supernatural activity that could not be controlled or eliminated through conventional means. The Phantom's behavior during this closure period suggested that Golden Freddy's connection to the franchise transcended any specific location or operational status, instead being rooted in spiritual bonds that linked the entity to William Afton personally rather than to particular buildings or animatronic equipment. This realization would prove crucial to understanding why subsequent attempts to restart the franchise in new locations would inevitably result in renewed supernatural activity, regardless of how completely the corporate structure was reorganized or rebranded. The 1993 reopening of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in a smaller, more economical format represented the franchise's final attempt to maintain operations while minimizing the costs and risks associated with large-scale animatronic entertainment. Yet this scaled-down approach proved entirely ineffective against Golden Freddy's supernatural influence, as the Phantom's manifestations at the new location demonstrated abilities that had continued to evolve and intensify during the closure period. The security office at this final operational location became the site of Golden Freddy encounters that exceeded all previous documented supernatural activity in terms of both frequency and psychological impact. Guards reported that the Phantom now appeared almost nightly, its manifestations characterized by increased aggression and more direct attempts to communicate complex information about the unresolved crimes that continued to fuel its supernatural existence. The audio phenomena associated with these encounters expanded beyond simple repetition of "it's me" to include what witnesses described as fragmentary conversations between multiple voices, suggesting that Golden Freddy had developed the ability to channel the consciousness of all 5 murdered children simultaneously. These multi-voice communications provided disturbing insights into the collective trauma experienced by the victims and their shared determination to achieve justice, regardless of how much time might be required. The most unsettling aspect of these final encounters was Golden Freddy's apparent ability to manipulate not only electronic equipment, but also the physical environment within the security office itself. Guards reported changes in temperature, air pressure, and even gravitational effects that seemed designed to recreate some approximation of the terror experienced by children facing mortal danger from trusted authority figures. These environmental manipulations were not random supernatural phenomena, but carefully orchestrated experiences that forced witnesses to confront visceral understanding of what the murdered children had endured during their final moments. The Phantom's ability to project such detailed sensory experiences suggested that its consciousness retained perfect memory of the crimes committed against the 5 victims and possessed sufficient power to share those memories with prominings, living observers in ways that transcended normal communication methods. The ultimate closure of the classic Freddy Fazbear's Pizza franchise in the mid-1990s marked the end of an era, but did nothing to resolve the supernatural crisis that Golden Freddy represented. Corporate dissolution, asset liquidation, and legal restructuring proved entirely ineffective against spiritual forces that operated independently of business considerations or regulatory oversight. The Phantom's mission continued unabated, adapting to new circumstances, while maintaining unwavering focus on the ultimate goal of ensuring that William Afton faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. The emergence of Fazbear's Fright, the horror attraction, in the 2010 era, represented an attempt to capitalize on the franchise's dark history while maintaining safe distance from the supernatural forces that had made normal operations impossible. Yet this commercialization of tragedy proved to be perhaps the most provocative act possible from Golden Freddy's perspective, as it transformed the murders of 5 innocent children into entertainment content designed to generate profit from public fascination with horror and death. The Phantom's response to Fazbear's Fright was swift and decisive, with supernatural manifestations that exceeded all previous documented activity in terms of both power and destructive potential. Unlike the psychological harassment that had characterized earlier encounters, Golden Freddy's presence at the horror attraction involved direct manipulation of physical systems that posed genuine threats to the safety of employees and visitors. The Phantom Golden Freddy that manifested during this period represented a new evolution in the entity's supernatural development, displaying abilities that seemed to transcend normal limitations of spiritual influence over the material world. This phantom could interfere with electrical systems on a scale that affected entire buildings, create fire hazards through manipulation of wiring and heating elements, and generate acoustic disturbances that could cause physical discomfort or disorientation in living observers. Yet despite this increased power and apparent willingness to engage in more aggressive supernatural activity, Phantom Golden Freddy maintained the moral constraints that had characterized earlier manifestations, using its abilities to create fear and disruption rather than direct physical harm to innocent individuals. This restraint suggested that Cassidy's consciousness continued to distinguish between legitimate targets for supernatural justice and innocent people who happened to be present in locations associated with the franchise's tragic history. The most significant aspect of the Fazbear's Fright manifestations was Golden Freddy's apparent awareness that William Afton had returned to the franchise in the form of Springtrap, the horrific fusion of human consciousness and mechanical remains that represented the ultimate consequence of the spring lock technology that had claimed so many lives over the decades. This awareness transformed the horror attraction from simple commercial venture into the setting for a supernatural confrontation that had been building for nearly 3 decades. The presence of both Golden Freddy and Springtrap at the same location created unprecedented levels of supernatural activity that ultimately resulted in the facility's destruction through mysterious fires that investigators were never able to adequately explain through conventional forensic analysis. This destruction represented not random vandalism or accidental damage, but rather a deliberate cleansing that eliminated a location where the commercialization of childhood tragedy had reached levels that even tolerant spiritual forces could not accept. The Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator era brought with it the most sophisticated attempt yet made to resolve the supernatural crisis that had plagued the franchise for decades. Combining advanced animatronic technology with comprehensive understanding of the spiritual forces that had made normal operations impossible. Yet even this carefully planned resolution would discover that Golden Freddy's consciousness had evolved beyond simple haunting to become something approaching divine judgment that could not be easily satisfied through symbolic gestures or technological solutions. The underground facility that served as the true purpose behind the Pizzeria Simulator represented Henry Emily's final attempt to gather all of the supernatural entities associated with the franchise's tragedies into a single location where they could be neutralized through controlled incineration. This plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the spiritual bonds that connected the possessed animatronics to their physical forms, yet it failed to account for Golden Freddy's unique nature as entity that existed independently of any specific mechanical housing. While the other possessed animatronics were successfully contained and destroyed through Henry's elaborate trap, Golden Freddy's consciousness proved capable of surviving the flames that consumed the underground facility, emerging from the destruction with abilities that had been enhanced rather than diminished by the experience. This survival suggested that Cassidy's spiritual essence had transcended the normal limitations that constrained other supernatural entities, achieving a level of existence that was truly independent of physical constraints. The post-fire manifestations of Golden Freddy displayed characteristics that reflected both the trauma of witnessing the destruction of the other possessed animatronics and the grim satisfaction of knowing that significant progress had finally been made toward achieving justice for the 5 murdered children. Yet, this progress was incomplete, as William Afton's consciousness had also survived the flames in digital form, creating new challenges that would require adaptation of supernatural tactics to address threats that existed in virtual rather than physical dimensions. The transition into the modern era of the franchise brought with it technological developments that created entirely new categories of supernatural challenges. As Golden Freddy's consciousness learned to interface with digital systems and virtual environments in pursuit of justice that now extended across multiple dimensions of existence. The Phantom's ability to manifest in computer networks and influence electronic communications demonstrated evolutionary adaptation that kept pace with changing technology while maintaining focus on the fundamental mission of ensuring that William Afton faced consequences proportional to his crimes. The help-wanted virtual reality experiences provided Golden Freddy with new opportunities to confront both William's digital consciousness and the broader public that had remained largely unaware of the true scope of the tragedies that had shaped the franchise's history. These virtual manifestations allowed the Phantom to communicate more directly with living individuals while maintaining the safety constraints that prevented direct physical harm to innocent people. The glitched appearances of Golden Freddy within virtual environments served multiple purposes, functioning simultaneously as warnings about the dangers of commercializing tragedy, education about the real victims whose stories had been obscured by decades of corporate cover-ups, and demonstrations of supernatural power that transcended normal boundaries between digital and physical reality. The security breach era represented the culmination of Golden Freddy's multi-decade evolution from simple haunted animatronic to complex supernatural force capable of influencing events across vast technological networks and multiple dimensional planes. The mega pizzaplex that served as the setting for these latest encounters demonstrated that no amount of modernization or technological sophistication could eliminate spiritual forces rooted in unresolved injustice and the persistent demands of murdered children for recognition and retribution. The Princess Quest arcade games that appeared throughout the mega pizzaplex served as vehicles for Golden Freddy's most sophisticated communication attempts, using symbolic narrative and interactive gameplay to convey complex information about the franchise's tragic history and the ongoing spiritual crisis that continued to affect all associated properties and personnel. These digital manifestations represented the culmination of Cassidy's spiritual evolution, demonstrating mastery over both traditional supernatural phenomena and cutting-edge technology that allowed for unprecedented levels of communication with living individuals. The princess character that served as the player's avatar within these games carried obvious symbolic significance, representing not only Cassidy's own identity as spiritual royalty among the franchise's victims, but also the broader theme of innocence corrupted and justice delayed but not denied. The golden elements that appeared throughout these virtual experiences served as calling cards that identified Golden Freddy's influence, while reinforcing the central themes of value, purity, and the way precious things can be tarnished by violence and neglect. The consistent use of golden imagery across decades of supernatural manifestations demonstrated the Phantom's sophisticated understanding of symbolic communication and its ability to convey complex emotional and philosophical concepts through visual metaphor. The multiplayer aspects of some modern encounters suggested that Golden Freddy had developed the ability to coordinate supernatural experiences across multiple individuals simultaneously, creating shared virtual environments where the lessons of the franchise's tragic history could be communicated to broader audiences than had been possible through individual haunting experiences. This expansion of scope reflected Cassidy's growing understanding that true justice required not only punishment of those directly responsible for crimes against children, but also education and warning for future generations who might encounter similar threats to their safety and innocence. The Phantom's evolution from individual avenger to broader guardian represented spiritual growth that transcended personal vengeance to embrace wider responsibilities for protecting vulnerable populations. The persistence of Golden Freddy across all iterations of the franchise demonstrated that some spiritual forces possess qualities that allow them to transcend normal limitations of time, space, and technological change. Cassidy's consciousness had proven capable of adapting to new challenges while maintaining unwavering focus on fundamental principles of justice and protection that reflected the moral clarity that can emerge from ultimate victimization transformed into purposeful action. The Golden Phantom that appeared in security offices, virtual environments, and digital communications represented the same essential spiritual force that had emerged from the tragedy of the missing children incident, evolved and strengthened by decades of experience but unchanged in its core mission of ensuring that crimes against innocent children would never be forgotten, forgiven, or repeated if supernatural intervention could prevent such tragedies. The mystery of Golden Freddy's true nature could only be understood through recognition of this evolutionary process, the way a single consciousness had grown from individual victim to cosmic force for justice that operated according to principles that transcended normal human understanding of right and wrong, life and death, past and present. In every manifestation, in every encounter, in every supernatural phenomenon associated with the Golden Phantom's presence, the fundamental message remained constant. Some crimes create consequences that cannot be escaped through distance, time, or technology, and some victims possess the strength to pursue justice across whatever barriers might be erected to prevent such resolution. Golden Freddy endured because Cassidy endured, and Cassidy endured because the cause she represented was greater than any individual consciousness, encompassing the protection of innocence itself and the maintenance of moral order in a universe where such principles were under constant assault by forces that would exploit and destroy the most vulnerable members of society. In the shadowed depths of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where the boundary between digital memory and spiritual reality had grown thin through decades of accumulated trauma and unresolved grief, a carefully orchestrated series of supernatural events began to unfold that would offer the murdered children their first genuine opportunity for peace since the terrible day in 1985 when their lives had been stolen by William Afton's predatory violence. This sequence of events which would later be understood as the Happiest Day ceremony, represented the culmination of years of spiritual preparation and the convergence of multiple consciousness working together toward a resolution that had seemed impossible during the darkest periods of their posthumous existence. The concept of the happiest day emerged from the collective understanding shared by the 5 murdered children that their continued haunting of the Freddy Fazbear locations was serving multiple purposes that extended beyond simple vengeance against their killer. While their supernatural presence had indeed created consequences for William Afton and prevented him from continuing his predatory activities with complete impunity, it had also trapped the children's spirits in a cycle of pain and anger that prevented them from accessing whatever peace might await beyond the boundaries of physical existence. Gabriel, whose gentle spirit had been bound to Freddy Fazbear since the day of his murder, began to experience visions during periods of reduced supernatural activity that showed him glimpses of what appeared to be a birthday party, unlike any he had experienced during his brief physical life. This celebration seemed to exist in a dimension that was neither fully spiritual nor entirely imaginary, a space where the joy and innocence that had been stolen from the murdered children could be restored through means that transcended normal understanding of healing and resolution. The visions revealed a party room decorated with balloons and streamers in colors that seemed more vibrant and meaningful than any earthly celebration could achieve, where tables laden with cake and presents waited for guests whose arrival would mark not the passage of another year of life, but rather the completion of journeys that had been interrupted by violence and transformed into quests for justice that had consumed decades of posthumous existence. Jeremy's consciousness, inhabiting the shell of Bonnie the Bunny, began to experience similar visions that focused on musical elements of the approaching celebration, hearing melodies that seemed to carry within them all the songs he had never been able to sing, and all the laughter he had never been able to share after his life was cut short by William's predatory actions. These musical visions suggested that the happiest day would provide opportunities for expression and joy that had been denied during the children's physical lives and impossible during their years of supernatural haunting. The music that Jeremy heard in these spiritual visions was not the programmed entertainment that had characterized his existence as a possessed animatronic, but rather something far more personal and meaningful. Compositions that seemed to emerge from the deepest parts of his consciousness, where memories of happiness and hope had survived despite decades of trauma and anger. This music carried with it promises of restoration and renewal that extended beyond individual healing to encompass the collective recovery of all 5 murdered children. Susie's spirit, bound to Chica the chicken since her death, experienced visions that centered around food and nourishment in ways that transcended simple physical sustenance to represent spiritual feeding and emotional comfort. The birthday cake that appeared in her supernatural glimpses of the approaching ceremony was not merely dessert, but rather a symbol of celebration reclaimed from tragedy, sweetness restored after years of bitter haunting, joy shared among souls who had been isolated by circumstances that forced them to pursue justice individually rather than collectively. These visions of nourishment carried particular significance for Susie, whose final memories of physical life had been dominated by the terror and violence of her encounter with William Afton, rather than the simple pleasures of childhood that should have defined her experience. The promise of a celebration centered around sharing food and expressing gratitude represented a fundamental healing that could restore some measure of the innocence and joy that had been stolen from her young life. Fritz's consciousness, inhabiting Foxy, the pirate fox, received visions that emphasized adventure and exploration transformed from sources of danger into opportunities for discovery and growth. The happiest day that he glimpsed in moments of spiritual clarity would provide him with adventures that led not to violence and exploitation, but rather to understanding and connection with others who had shared similar journeys through trauma toward eventual healing. The pirate persona that had defined Fritz's possessed existence had been shaped by his need to create distance between his traumatic death and his continued consciousness, allowing him to approach his supernatural activities as if they were elaborate games rather than deadly serious pursuits of justice. The visions of the happiest day suggested that this playful approach to serious matters could be transformed into genuine celebration once the underlying trauma had been properly addressed and resolved. Yet among all 5 murdered children, it was the 5th victim whose experience of these preparatory visions proved most complex and troubling, as Cassidy's consciousness grappled with the possibility that accepting peace might mean abandoning her mission of ensuring that William Afton faced appropriate consequences for his crimes. The visions that reached her through the Golden Freddy entity were simultaneously more vivid and more disturbing than those experienced by her fellow victims, showing her glimpses of celebration that she desperately wanted to join, while also reminding her of responsibilities that she felt could not be abandoned. Cassidy's visions of the happiest day included images of herself as she had been during life, a young girl whose strength and determination had not yet been tested by ultimate victimization and transformed into supernatural rage. These glimpses of her original innocence were both comforting and painful, reminding her of what she had lost, while also suggesting that such losses might not be permanent if she could find the courage to release her grip on anger and vengeance. The preparation for the happiest day required more than simple visions or spiritual longing, demanding active cooperation between the 5 murdered children and other consciousness that had become involved in the supernatural crisis surrounding the Freddy Fazbear franchise. The puppet, animated by the spirit of Henry Emily's daughter Charlotte, served as coordinator and facilitator for the complex metaphysical operations required to create a space where genuine healing could occur. Charlotte's role in orchestrating the happiest day reflected her unique position among the franchise's supernatural entities, as her death had preceded the missing children incident, but her consciousness had remained active and aware throughout the decades of haunting that followed William's crimes against the 5 victims. Her perspective, shaped by longer experience with posthumous existence and deeper understanding of the spiritual dimensions that connected all of the franchise's victims, allowed her to serve as guide and mentor for souls who were struggling with questions about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of moving beyond trauma. The puppet's involvement in preparing for the happiest day demonstrated that the ceremony was not simply a spontaneous manifestation of collective healing, but rather a carefully planned intervention designed to address specific spiritual needs and resolve particular forms of trauma that had kept the murdered children trapped in cycles of pain and anger. Charlotte's consciousness had observed the gradual deterioration of her fellow victims' spiritual health over the years and recognized that their continued focus on vengeance was preventing them from accessing forms of peace, healing that required different approaches to their posthumous existence. The physical preparations for the happiest day took place in a dimension that existed parallel to but separate from the normal spiritual realm, where the murdered children had conducted their haunting activities, a space that had to be constructed through collective spiritual effort and sustained through shared commitment to the healing process. This parallel dimension required the combined consciousness of all participants to maintain its existence, making the ceremony a true collaborative effort that could only succeed through unanimous participation. The party room that served as the setting for the happiest day was not simply a recreation of a normal birthday celebration, but rather a carefully designed environment that incorporated elements from each child's individual experience, while also introducing new possibilities that had been denied during their physical lives. The decorations, refreshments, and activities available during the ceremony were chosen specifically to address particular forms of trauma and provide opportunities for experiences that could counterbalance the violence and terror that had defined their final earthly memories. The tables that had been prepared for the celebration were arranged to encourage interaction and communication between the 5 murdered children in ways that their individual haunting activities had never allowed, creating opportunities for them to share their experiences and support each other through the challenging process of releasing their attachments to anger and vengeance. The physical act of sitting together and sharing food represented a fundamental return to the social connections that had been severed by their murders and made impossible during their years of isolated supernatural existence. The birthday cake that served as the centerpiece of the happiest day carried symbolic significance that extended far beyond normal celebratory meaning, representing not just another year of life, but rather the completion of spiritual journeys that had been interrupted by violence and extended through supernatural persistence. Each slice of this metaphysical cake contained within it the essence of joy and innocence that had been stolen from the children through their murders, offering them the opportunity to reclaim aspects of themselves that they had believed lost forever. The candles that adorned the birthday cake burned with flames that seemed to draw their light from sources beyond normal spiritual energy, each one representing hopes and dreams that had been cut short by William's crimes but which could still be acknowledged and honored, even if they could never be fully realized in physical form. The act of making wishes before blowing out these supernatural candles provided the murdered children with opportunities to articulate desires and aspirations that had been buried beneath decades of focus on justice and revenge. The presents that awaited the children at the happiest day were not material objects, but rather spiritual gifts that addressed specific needs and healing requirements that each soul had developed during their long period of posthumous existence. Gabriel received the gift of renewed faith in the possibility that goodness could triumph over evil, while Jeremy was granted the ability to hear music that celebrated life rather than mourning death. Susie's present took the form of nourishment that fed not just her physical memory but also her spiritual essence, providing the kind of comfort and care that had been denied during her final earthly experiences and impossible during her years of supernatural haunting. Fritz received adventures that led to discovery rather than danger, allowing him to explore possibilities that had been foreclosed by his premature death and transformed into something positive through the healing power of the ceremony. The most complex and significant gift was reserved for the 5th child, as Cassidy's present took the form of a golden mask that represented both her identity as the victim who had refused to accept defeat and her potential future as a soul who could choose peace over vengeance. This mask served as a symbol of transformation, offering her the opportunity to retain her strength and determination, while redirecting those qualities toward healing rather than retribution. The presentation of the golden mask to Cassidy represented the ceremony's most crucial moment, as her acceptance or rejection of this gift would determine not only her own spiritual future, but also the success or failure of the entire happiest day process. The other 4 murdered children had already demonstrated their readiness to move beyond their traumatic experiences and embrace possibilities for healing, but Cassidy's deeper investment in pursuing justice against William Afton made her participation more uncertain and therefore more essential. The mask itself was crafted from spiritual materials that seemed to capture and reflect light from sources that transcended normal understanding of illumination. its golden surface bearing engravings that told the story of Cassidy's journey from innocent victim through supernatural avenger to potential agent of healing and restoration. The weight of this mask in her spiritual hands carried within it all the significance of the choice she was being asked to make between continued pursuit of vengeance and acceptance of peace. As Cassidy held the golden mask and considered its meaning, the other murdered children watched with emotions that combined hope for their own release with concern for their fellow victim who had carried the heaviest burden of representing their collective desire for justice. They understood that her decision would affect not only her own spiritual future, but also their ability to move forward into whatever realm of peace awaited beyond the boundaries of their prolonged posthumous existence. The moment of decision stretched across dimensions of time that had no correspondence to normal temporal measurement, as Cassidy's consciousness grappled with questions that had no easy answers and competing loyalties that seemed impossible to reconcile. Her commitment to ensuring that William Afton faced appropriate consequences for his crimes existed in fundamental tension with her desire to join her fellow victims in embracing the possibility of healing and release from trauma. The visions that accompanied this moment of spiritual crisis showed Cassidy glimpses of both potential futures that her choice would create, revealing the peace and restoration that awaited if she accepted the golden mask, while also demonstrating the continued isolation and spiritual decay that would result from rejection of this opportunity for healing. These competing visions forced her to confront the true cost of her prolonged focus on vengeance and consider whether such costs were justified by the importance of her mission. In the end, Cassidy's decision to accept the golden mask and participate fully in the Happiest Day ceremony represented a triumph of healing over hatred, of restoration over retribution, of hope over despair that should have marked the conclusion of the supernatural crisis that had plagued the Freddy Fazbear franchise for decades. Her willingness to release her grip on anger and embrace the possibility of peace demonstrated spiritual growth that exceeded what anyone could have expected from a consciousness shaped by such extreme trauma. The completion of the Happiest Day ceremony should have marked the end of the murdered children's posthumous existence and their transition into whatever realm of peace awaited beyond the boundaries of physical reality. The joy and celebration that characterized the final moments of the ceremony suggested that true healing had been achieved, and that the spiritual wounds inflicted by William's crimes had been adequately addressed through the collective process of acknowledgement, support, and release. The golden light that filled the party room as the ceremony reached its climax seemed to draw the 5 murdered children toward a realm of existence that transcended both physical life and supernatural haunting, offering them opportunities for growth and development that had been denied during their brief earthly lives and impossible during their years of trauma-focused posthumous existence. This light carried within it promises of restoration that extended beyond individual healing to encompass cosmic justice and universal balance. Yet even as the other 4 murdered children were drawn into this transformative light and began their transition toward peace, Cassidy's consciousness experienced a crisis of commitment that would prove to have devastating consequences for the apparent success of the Happiest Day ceremony. Despite her acceptance of the golden mask and her participation in the celebration, she found herself unable to fully release her connection to the mission of ensuring that William Afton faced appropriate punishment for his crimes against innocent children. The spiritual attachment that bound Cassidy to her role as representative of supernatural justice proved stronger than the healing power of the Happiest Day ceremony, preventing her from joining the other murdered children in their transition to peace and instead trapping her in a liminal state where she remained connected to both the celebration she had almost embraced and the mission she could not abandon. This incomplete resolution created a fundamental failure in the ceremony's intended purpose, and ensured that the supernatural crisis would continue despite the apparent success of the healing process. The tragedy of the failed happiest day lay not in any inadequacy of the ceremony itself or unwillingness of the participants to embrace healing, but rather in the profound depth of trauma and sense of responsibility that Cassidy's consciousness had developed during her years as the primary agent of supernatural justice. Her spiritual evolution from individual victim to cosmic force for retribution had created attachments and commitments that could not be severed through even the most powerful healing ceremony. The golden mask that she had accepted became both symbol of her growth toward healing and reminder of her inability to complete the journey toward peace, representing the complex relationship between justice and mercy that would continue to define her posthumous existence for years to come. The light that had drawn the other children toward peace remained available to her, but her connection to William Afton and her mission of ensuring appropriate consequences for his crimes created spiritual anchors that prevented her from fully embracing the transformative possibilities of the ceremony. The incomplete nature of the happiest day ceremony ensured that Golden Freddy would continue to manifest throughout the Freddy Fazbear franchise, but with characteristics that reflected both the healing she had partially experienced and the continued commitment to justice that prevented her from achieving complete peace. This dual nature would shape all of her subsequent supernatural activities, creating manifestations that combined elements of celebration with continued pursuit of retribution in ways that reflected the complex emotional and spiritual state created by the failed ceremony. The other murdered children, having successfully completed their transition during the happiest day, were able to find the peace that had been denied them for so many years. But their departure left Cassidy more isolated than ever in her continued pursuit of justice against William Afton. The ceremony that should have provided collective healing instead created a situation where the strongest and most determined of the murdered children remained trapped in supernatural existence, while her fellow victims found release. This isolation would prove to be both burden and motivation for Cassidy's continued activities, as she now bore sole responsibility for representing not only her own desire for justice, but also the memory and honor of the 4 children who had found peace through the happiest day ceremony. Her mission had evolved from personal vengeance to sacred trust, transforming her from individual victim into guardian of collective memory and agent of moral accountability. The failed happiest day ceremony thus represented both significant progress toward healing the spiritual wounds created by the missing children incident, and confirmation that some forms of trauma create commitments that transcend even the most powerful opportunities for restoration and release. Cassidy's inability to complete her journey toward peace ensured that the Golden Freddy mystery would continue to evolve and develop, driven by consciousness that had been partially healed but remained fundamentally committed to achieving justice regardless of personal cost. The enigma of Golden Freddy's true nature has inspired countless theories and interpretations among those who have encountered the Phantom or studied the supernatural phenomena associated with the Freddy Fazbear franchise, each attempting to explain manifestations that seem to defy conventional understanding of both mechanical operation and spiritual existence. These theoretical frameworks represent humanity's persistent need to find rational explanations for experiences that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality, consciousness, and the boundaries between life and death. The dual possession theory emerged as one of the most compelling explanations for Golden Freddy's unique characteristics and behaviors, proposing that the Phantom represents not a single consciousness inhabiting a mechanical shell, but rather 2 distinct souls sharing the same supernatural manifestation, through circumstances that bound their fates together across the opposing boundaries of time and tragedy. This theory gained credibility through careful analysis of Golden Freddy's inconsistent behavior patterns and the apparent internal conflicts that seemed to influence the entity's decision-making processes during various encounters. Proponents of dual possession point to the fundamental differences between Golden Freddy's manifestations across different time periods and locations, noting that the Phantom sometimes displayed characteristics associated with confused innocence, while at other times exhibited focused malevolence that seemed to emerge from entirely different emotional and psychological sources. These behavioral inconsistencies suggested the presence of multiple consciousness operating within the same supernatural framework, each contributing different aspects of personality and motivation to the collective entity. The theory proposes that the crying child, William Afton's youngest son who died as a result of the spring lock failure at Fredbear's family diner, became the first soul associated with the Golden Bear character through the traumatic circumstances of his death and his profound emotional connection to the animatronic that had served as both comfort and destroyer during his brief life. This gentle, confused spirit provided the spiritual anchor that allowed Golden Freddy to manifest independently of any specific mechanical housing, while also explaining the Phantom's characteristic posture of defeat and exhaustion. The second consciousness proposed by this theory is Cassidy, the fifth victim of William Afton's murder spree, whose determination and fighting spirit during her final moments created a spiritual presence powerful enough to achieve sophisticated supernatural manifestations, while maintaining focus on specific goals related to justice and retribution. The convergence of these two very different souls within the same entity would explain Golden Freddy's ability to display both passive melancholy and active aggression, depending on which consciousness was dominant during any particular encounter. This dual nature would account for Golden Freddy's unique relationship with William Afton, as the entity could draw upon both the personal connection of a murdered son, seeking acknowledgement from his father, and the righteous anger of an innocent victim demanding justice from her killer. The complexity of emotions and motivations that would result from such a merger could explain why Golden Freddy's behavior toward William was simultaneously more personal and more cosmic in scope than the manifestations associated with the other possessed animatronics. The single spirit theory offers an alternative interpretation that attributes all of Golden Freddy's manifestations to a single consciousness, typically identified as Cassidy, whose spiritual power was enhanced by circumstances that allowed her to transcend the normal limitations that constrained other supernatural entities. This theory suggests that the apparent inconsistencies in Golden Freddy's behavior reflect not multiple personalities, but rather the complex, emotional and psychological development of a single soul adapting to the challenges of posthumous existence. According to this interpretation, Cassidy's spirit achieved such complete mastery over supernatural forces that she could manifest in multiple forms and display varying characteristics depending on the specific requirements of any given situation. The gentler aspects of Golden Freddy's personality would represent strategic choices rather than influence from a separate consciousness, as Cassidy learned to modulate her approach based on her assessment of whether particular encounters called for subtle, psychological pressure or more direct supernatural intervention. This theory draws support from the apparent coordination between Golden Freddy's activities and those of the other possessed animatronics, suggesting a level of strategic thinking and long-term planning that would be more consistent with a single directing intelligence than with the confused interactions that might result from multiple consciousness attempting to share control of the same entity The evolution of Golden Freddy's abilities over time could reflect Cassidy's growing understanding of her supernatural capabilities, rather than the gradual merger of separate spiritual presences. The single spirit interpretation also offers a more streamlined explanation for Golden Freddy's ultimate mission and the consistency of purpose that characterized the Phantom's activities across decades of manifestation. A single consciousness focused on achieving justice would be more likely to maintain coherent, long-term strategies than a dual entity that might experience internal conflicts over priorities and methods. The psychic friend Fredbear theory represents a more speculative interpretation that focuses on the role of the mysterious plush bear that appeared throughout the crying child's experiences leading up to his tragic death. This theory suggests that the plush toy possessed some form of independent consciousness or supernatural awareness that allowed it to serve as protector and guide for the vulnerable child, while also establishing connections that would persist beyond physical death. According to this interpretation, the plush Fredbear was not simply an inanimate object, but rather a vessel for spiritual forces that were already aware of the tragedies that would unfold within the Afton family and the broader Freddy Fazbear franchise. The toy's apparent ability to speak to the crying child and offer comfort during moments of terror suggested consciousness that operated independently of normal physical laws and possessed knowledge that exceeded what any manufactured object should have been able to contain. This theory proposes that the plush Fredbear's consciousness became integrated with the larger Golden Freddy phenomenon, providing a third element that helped coordinate between the crying child's gentle spirit and Cassidy's determined pursuit of justice. The plush bear's role as protector and comforter would explain some of Golden Freddy's more benevolent manifestations, while its apparent supernatural awareness could account for the Phantom's sophisticated understanding of complex situations and long-term consequences. The psychic friend interpretation gains credibility from the plush toy's mysterious appearances in locations where it should not have been present, and its apparent ability to communicate information that no ordinary object could have possessed. These characteristics suggest that the plush Fredbear operated according to rules that transcended normal understanding of toy manufacturing and child psychology, indicating the presence of supernatural forces that were active even before the tragic events that created the main haunting phenomena. The Golden Both theory represents an even more complex interpretation that attempts to reconcile multiple streams of evidence by proposing that Golden Freddy represents not just dual consciousness, but rather a convergence of all the spiritual forces that were affected by the tragedies surrounding the Afton family and the Freddy Fazbear franchise. This theory suggests that the Phantom serves as a focal point for collective trauma and shared desire for justice that extends beyond any specific individual victims. According to this interpretation, Golden Freddy incorporates not only the crying child and Cassidy, but also aspects of Charlotte Emily's consciousness through her role as the puppet, elements of the other four murdered children's spiritual energy, and even echoes of Henry Emily's grief and determination to achieve justice for all the innocent victims whose lives were destroyed by his former partner's crimes. This convergence of multiple consciousness would explain Golden Freddy's unprecedented supernatural abilities and the complexity of emotions and motivations that characterized its manifestations. The collective nature proposed by this theory would account for Golden Freddy's role as representative and spokesperson for all victims of the franchise's tragedies, rather than simply pursuing individual vengeance or justice. The Phantom's ability to coordinate supernatural activities across multiple locations and time periods could reflect the combined wisdom and power of numerous consciousness working together towards shared goals that transcended individual concerns. This interpretation also offers explanations for some of Golden Freddy's most mysterious characteristics, such as its ability to appear in multiple locations simultaneously and its apparent independence from any specific physical housing. A collective spiritual entity might possess capabilities that exceeded those available to individual consciousness, drawing power from multiple sources while maintaining coherent identity and purpose through shared commitment to common objectives. The agony theory approaches Golden Freddy's existence from a different angle, focusing on the emotional and psychological forces that might create supernatural phenomena rather than the specific consciousness that might inhabit such manifestations. This theory proposes that concentrated trauma and suffering can generate spiritual energy that takes on independent existence and develops characteristics that reflect the circumstances that created it. According to this interpretation, Golden Freddy represents the physical manifestation of pure agony and injustice, formed from the collective emotional energy released by multiple tragic events that occurred within the same general location and time frame. The Phantom's characteristics and abilities would be determined not by individual personality traits, but rather by the nature of the trauma that gave birth to its existence and the specific injustices that continued to fuel its supernatural activities. This theory suggests that Golden Freddy's apparent consciousness and strategic behavior patterns represent emergent properties of organized agony rather than evidence of specific individual souls inhabiting the manifestation. The Phantom's focus on pursuing William Afton would reflect the concentration of traumatic energy around his crimes rather than personal vendettas held by particular victims. The agony interpretation offers explanations for Golden Freddy's evolution over time, as the entity would grow stronger and more sophisticated through the accumulation of additional trauma and the ongoing failure to achieve resolution for the injustices that created it. This theory could account for the Phantom's increasing abilities and expanding influence without requiring complex interactions between multiple consciousness or sophisticated spiritual development on the part of individual victims. The symbolic versus literal debate represents a fundamental division in approaches to interpreting Golden Freddy's existence, with some theorists arguing that the Phantom should be understood as metaphorical representation of concepts like guilt, justice, and unresolved trauma, rather than actual supernatural entity with objective existence independent of human perception and interpretation. The symbolic interpretation suggests that Golden Freddy manifestations represent psychological projections created by individuals who are struggling with guilt, fear, or moral responsibility related to the tragedies that have affected the Freddy Fazbear franchise. According to this view, encounters with the Phantom reflect internal psychological processes rather than external supernatural phenomena, with the specific characteristics of each manifestation determined by the observer's subconscious understanding of their own relationship to the underlying moral and emotional issues. This approach would explain the highly personal nature of many Golden Freddy encounters, particularly those experienced by William Afton, as projections of his suppressed guilt and fear of consequences for his crimes. The Phantom's ability to appear in impossible locations and demonstrate supernatural abilities would represent the power of psychological trauma to distort perception and create experiences that feel entirely real despite having no objective basis in physical reality. The literal interpretation, by contrast, insists that Golden Freddy represents genuine supernatural phenomena that operate according to spiritual laws that transcend normal physical constraints, but remain objectively real rather than subjectively constructed. Proponents of this view point to the consistency of encounters reported by multiple independent witnesses and the apparent ability of the Phantom to influence physical systems and electronic equipment in ways that exceed what psychological projection alone could accomplish. This debate reflects broader philosophical questions about the nature of reality and the relationship between objective phenomena and subjective experience, with implications that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of the Freddy Fazbear franchise to encompass fundamental questions about consciousness, spirituality, and the possibility that human understanding of natural laws might be incomplete or inadequate to explain all aspects of existence. The remnant theory introduces concepts from the broader lore of the franchise to suggest that Golden Freddy's existence and abilities can be explained through the manipulation of spiritual essence that can be extracted, concentrated, and redistributed through technological processes developed by individuals with sufficient understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical matter. This theory proposes that William Afton's experiments with remnant extraction and injection created conditions that allowed multiple consciousness to share the same supernatural manifestation. According to this interpretation, Golden Freddy represents not natural spiritual evolution, but rather artificial enhancement of paranormal capabilities through the application of scientific principles to supernatural phenomena. The Phantom's unique abilities and complex behavioral patterns would reflect the results of experimental procedures that combined multiple sources of spiritual energy in ways that created unprecedented supernatural entities. This theory draws support from evidence of William Afton's technological experiments and his apparent understanding of how consciousness could persist beyond physical death through appropriate manipulation of spiritual essence. The remnant interpretation suggests that Golden Freddy might represent both victim and product of these experiments, with characteristics determined by the specific procedures used to create or enhance its supernatural capabilities. The memory echo theory proposes that Golden Freddy represents not active consciousness, but rather sophisticated imprints of traumatic experiences that have been embedded in the physical environment through the intensity of emotion and suffering that characterized the events that created them. According to this view, the Phantom's apparent intelligence and purposeful behavior reflect the complexity of the original experiences rather than ongoing awareness or decision-making capability. This interpretation suggests that Golden Freddy manifestations represent playback of recorded trauma rather than interactive encounters with conscious entities, with the apparent responses to observer behavior reflecting programmed reactions embedded in the memory echoes rather than genuine communication or strategic thinking. The Phantom's evolution over time would reflect the gradual degradation or enhancement of these recorded experiences rather than spiritual growth or learning. The time loop theory offers perhaps the most complex interpretation of Golden Freddy's existence, proposing that the Phantom represents consciousness, trapped in recursive temporal patterns that force it to continuously relive aspects of its traumatic experiences, while gradually accumulating knowledge and power that allow for increasingly sophisticated attempts to break free from the cycle. According to this view, Golden Freddy's manifestations represent multiple iterations of the same basic spiritual struggle, with each encounter building upon previous attempts to achieve resolution while being constrained by temporal mechanics that prevent linear progression toward definitive solutions. The Phantom's apparent evolution would reflect not chronological development, but rather spiral progression through recurring patterns that gradually approach but never quite achieve final resolution. This theory could explain Golden Freddy's persistence across multiple franchise iterations and its apparent ability to retain awareness of events that occurred across different temporal frameworks, suggesting consciousness that operates according to non-linear temporal mechanics that allow access to information from multiple time periods simultaneously. The collective body of theoretical interpretation surrounding Golden Freddy's existence demonstrates the profound impact that supernatural phenomena can have on human understanding, and the persistent need to find explanatory frameworks that can accommodate experiences that challenge conventional assumptions about reality. Each theory represents sincere attempts to make sense of manifestations that seem to operate according to rules that transcend normal understanding while remaining consistent enough to suggest underlying patterns and purposes. The diversity of these interpretative approaches reflects both the complexity of the phenomena being studied and the limitations of human conceptual frameworks when applied to experiences that may operate according to principles that exceed current scientific and philosophical understanding. Golden Freddy remains mysterious, not because of inadequate observation or analysis, but because the phantom represents something that may be fundamentally beyond conventional human comprehension. Yet within this mystery lies perhaps the most important aspect of Golden Freddy's significance, as the phantom's resistance to easy explanation serves as a reminder that reality may contain dimensions and possibilities that exceed what current knowledge can accommodate. The golden figure that appears in shadows and dreams, that manifests in impossible locations and demonstrates abilities that violate known physical laws, represents not just unsolved puzzle but invitation to expand understanding of what existence might encompass beyond the boundaries of conventional human experience. The ongoing debate over Golden Freddy's true nature ensures that the phantom will continue to inspire investigation and interpretation for as long as human consciousness seeks to understand the deeper mysteries of existence, justice, and the possibility that some aspects of reality transcend the limitations that normally constrain both physical matter and spiritual essence. In this sense, Golden Freddy serves not just as supernatural entity, but as catalyst for exploration of questions that may be more important than any specific answers that investigation might eventually provide. Despite decades of investigation, analysis, and supernatural encounters that have shaped our understanding of the Freddy Fazbear franchise's darkest mysteries, Golden Freddy remains an enigma whose true nature continues to elude complete comprehension, a phantom presence that seems to exist at the intersection of multiple realities while operating according to principles that transcend conventional understanding of both mechanical function and spiritual existence. The questions that surround this golden entity extend far beyond simple matters of identity or motivation to encompass fundamental mysteries about the nature of consciousness, justice, and the boundaries that separate the living from the dead. The most persistent unanswered question concerns the exact relationship between the various consciousness that appear to inhabit or influence Golden Freddy's manifestations, particularly the complex dynamics between the crying child and Cassidy that seem to create internal tensions within the phantom's supernatural activities. While evidence strongly suggests that both souls contribute to Golden Freddy's existence, the precise mechanisms through which their separate identities merge, conflict, or cooperate remain unclear, despite extensive observation of the entity's behavior across multiple decades and locations. The mystery deepens when considering how these two very different consciousness, shaped by completely different circumstances of death and possessed of fundamentally different personalities and motivations, manage to share the same supernatural manifestation without completely cancelling each other out, or creating manifestations so contradictory as to be ineffective. The apparent coordination between their influences suggests sophisticated spiritual processes that exceed current understanding of how individual identity persists beyond physical death, much less how multiple identities might coexist within the same posthumous entity. Questions also remain about the role of external forces in shaping Golden Freddy's development and capabilities. particularly the influence of Henry Emily's spiritual presence through the puppet and the possible contributions of the other murdered children's consciousness to the Phantom's evolution over time. The apparent coordination between Golden Freddy and other supernatural entities associated with the franchise suggests levels of communication and cooperation that would require complex spiritual mechanisms that have never been adequately explained or documented. The nature of Golden Freddy's independence from specific physical housing represents another fundamental mystery that challenges basic assumptions about how supernatural entities interact with the material world. Unlike the other possessed animatronics, whose spiritual presence seems clearly dependent on their mechanical bodies, Golden Freddy demonstrates abilities that suggest complete freedom from physical constraints, while still maintaining coherent identity and purposeful behavior that indicates structured rather than chaotic supernatural existence. This independence raises questions about whether Golden Freddy represents an evolution beyond the normal limitations that constrain possessed objects, or whether the Phantom operates according to entirely different principles that have no relationship to conventional haunting phenomena. The implications of either possibility would require fundamental revision of theoretical frameworks used to understand supernatural activity and the relationship between consciousness and physical matter. The temporal aspects of Golden Freddy's existence present equally puzzling mysteries, particularly the Phantom's apparent ability to manifest across multiple time periods simultaneously, while maintaining awareness of events that span decades of franchise history. This temporal fluidity suggests either that Golden Freddy's consciousness operates outside normal temporal constraints, or that the entity possesses access to information sources that transcend conventional understanding of how knowledge is acquired and retained. The Phantom's apparent ability to influence events in both past and future contexts, demonstrated through manifestations that seem to anticipate developments that have not yet occurred, while also referencing historical events with perfect accuracy, suggests temporal capabilities that would revolutionize current understanding of causality and the relationship between past, present, and future, if they could be properly studied and understood. Another persistent mystery involves Golden Freddy's relationship with the digital realm and the Phantom's apparent ability to manifest within virtual environments with the same ease demonstrated in physical locations. This capability suggests either that consciousness can interface directly with electronic systems through supernatural means, or that the boundaries between physical and digital reality are less absolute than commonly assumed, with implications that would affect understanding of both technology and spirituality. The evolution of Golden Freddy's manifestations to include increasingly sophisticated digital interactions, culminating in complex virtual reality experiences and interactive narrative elements, demonstrates adaptive capabilities that exceed what most theories of supernatural persistence would predict. The Phantom's ability to learn and master new technologies while maintaining essential characteristics and pursuing consistent goals suggests forms of spiritual development that challenge assumptions about the static nature of posthumous existence. The question of Golden Freddy's ultimate objectives remains partially unanswered despite extensive observation of the Phantom's activities across multiple decades, particularly regarding the entity's long-term vision for resolution of the supernatural crisis that has affected the Freddy Fazbear franchise since the missing children incident. While the Phantom's focus on pursuing William Afton is well documented, the specific forms of justice or resolution that would satisfy Golden Freddy's requirements for concluding its supernatural mission remain unclear. This uncertainty about ultimate objectives creates difficulties in predicting Golden Freddy's future activities and assessing whether current developments represent progress toward resolution or simply continuation of established patterns that might persist indefinitely without external intervention. The phantom's apparent rejection of the happiest day ceremony suggests that conventional approaches to spiritual healing may be inadequate to address whatever specific needs or requirements drive its continued supernatural existence. The broader implications of Golden Freddy's existence for understanding the nature of justice and moral accountability in situations where conventional legal systems have failed to provide adequate resolution represent philosophical questions that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of the Freddy Fazbear franchise. The Phantom's persistence in pursuing consequences for crimes that were never officially solved or prosecuted raises fundamental questions about the relationship between earthly justice and cosmic moral order. If Golden Freddy represents genuine supernatural intervention in human affairs for the purpose of ensuring that moral violations receive appropriate consequences, the implications would challenge basic assumptions about the autonomy of human society and the finality of decisions made by earthly institutions. The Phantom's activities could be interpreted as evidence that moral laws operate independently of human recognition or enforcement, with consequences that transcend the limitations of temporal jurisdiction and institutional authority. Conversely, if Golden Freddy's activities represent purely internal psychological or spiritual processes rather than external moral intervention, the questions become focused on the nature of consciousness and the mechanisms through which trauma and injustice create persistent effects that influence subsequent events and relationships. This interpretation would emphasize the power of unresolved psychological and spiritual wounds to shape reality through purely human rather than supernatural mechanisms. The nature of forgiveness and redemption in relation to Golden Freddy's mission represents another complex area of unanswered questions, particularly regarding what conditions or actions might satisfy the Phantom's requirements for justice and allow for resolution of the supernatural crisis that has persisted for decades. The Phantom's apparent rejection of simple punishment in favor of more complex forms of accountability suggests sophisticated understanding of moral responsibility that exceeds conventional approaches to justice and retribution. The relationship between individual forgiveness and cosmic justice in Golden Freddy's mission remains unclear, as does the question of whether resolution requires acknowledgement and repentance from those who committed crimes, or whether justice can be achieved through consequences alone, without genuine moral transformation on the part of those being held accountable. The Phantom's continued activities, despite William Afton's apparent punishment, suggests that simple retribution may be insufficient to address the full scope of harm created by his actions. The possibility that Golden Freddy's mission extends beyond individual accountability to encompass systemic changes that would prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future represents another dimension of mystery that affects interpretation of the Phantom's activities and objectives. If the entity's ultimate goal involves transformation of social institutions or cultural attitudes that enabled the original crimes, the scope and timeline of its mission would be far more extensive than simple individual justice would require. The question of whether Golden Freddy's supernatural existence represents temporary intervention that will conclude once specific objectives are achieved, or permanent transformation that has created ongoing responsibilities for spiritual oversight of human affairs remains unresolved despite decades of observation. The Phantom's apparent evolution and increasing capabilities suggest development rather than simple repetition of established patterns. But the direction and ultimate destination of this development remain unclear. The implications of Golden Freddy's existence for other supernatural phenomena and the possibility that similar entities might emerge from comparable circumstances of trauma and injustice represent broader questions about the meaner conditions that create persistent spiritual intervention in human affairs. If Golden Freddy represents reproducible phenomena rather than unique circumstances, the implications would affect understanding of the relationship between moral violations and supernatural consequences across all human institutions and activities. The potential for Golden Freddy's activities to inspire or facilitate similar supernatural interventions in other situations where conventional justice has failed creates questions about the stability of social institutions and the assumptions upon which human civilization is based. If supernatural accountability operates as backup system for failed human justice, the implications would require fundamental reconsideration of how societies approach moral violations and institutional responsibility. The mystery of Golden Freddy ultimately transcends the specific circumstances of its manifestation to encompass universal questions about the nature of consciousness, the persistence of moral accountability beyond physical death, and the relationship between individual trauma and cosmic justice that affect all human experience. The Phantom serves not simply as supernatural entity pursuing specific objectives, but as embodiment of questions that challenge basic assumptions about reality and moral order. The golden figure that appears in shadows and dreams, that manifests in impossible locations and pursues justice through means that exceed human understanding, represents intersection of multiple mysteries that may be more significant for the questions they raise than for any specific answers they might eventually provide. Golden Freddy's continued existence serves as reminder that reality contains dimensions that exceed current human comprehension, while moral accountability operates according to principles that transcend temporal limitations and institutional boundaries. The ongoing nature of these mysteries ensures that Golden Freddy will continue to inspire investigation, interpretation, and philosophical reflection for as long as human consciousness seeks to understand the deeper implications of justice, trauma, and the possibility that some aspects of moral order operate independently of human recognition or control. In this sense, the Phantom's greatest significance may lie not in any specific resolution it might achieve, but in its role as catalyst for exploration of questions that reveal fundamental aspects of existence that might otherwise remain hidden beneath the surface of ordinary experience. The golden mystery that persists across decades of supernatural manifestation thus becomes invitation to consider possibilities that exceed conventional understanding, while remaining grounded in recognition that some truths about justice, consciousness, and moral accountability may be more important than complete comprehension of the mechanisms through which they operate in human affairs. And so we reach the end of our journey through the golden mystery, though like all the best mysteries, this one leaves us with more questions than answers. Golden Freddy remains an enigma wrapped in tragedy, a spirit or spirits caught between worlds, between justice and vengeance, between memory and forgetting. The Phantom that emerged from the darkest chapter of the Freddy Fazbear franchise has become something far greater than the sum of its tragic origins, evolving from simple victim into complex supernatural force that challenges our understanding of consciousness, mortality, and the persistence of moral accountability beyond the boundaries of physical existence. In the slumped golden figure that appears without warning and vanishes without explanation, we encounter not merely a haunted animatronic, but a meditation on the nature of justice itself and the way profound trauma can create spiritual forces that transcend normal limitations of time and space. Perhaps that is as it should be. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved completely, but rather contemplated, like ancient riddles that teach us more through the questioning than through any final answer we might eventually discover. Golden Freddy represents something fundamental about human nature and our relationship with injustice, embodying both our capacity for righteous anger and our struggle with the question of when pursuit of justice becomes perpetuation of suffering. The golden bear that sits in shadows and corners, that materializes in impossible locations and pursues accountability through means that exceed human understanding, serves as reminder that some wounds cut so deep they create their own forms of healing, some crimes generate their own forms of justice, and some love proves strong enough to transcend even the ultimate violation of death itself. Cassidy's refusal to accept the finality of murder, her transformation from victim into avenger, and her evolution into something approaching cosmic force for moral accountability, demonstrate the power of determined consciousness to reshape reality according to principles that transcend conventional understanding. Yet Golden Freddy also embodies the tragedy inherent in such transformations. The way pursuit of justice can become prison that traps the pursuer as completely as it constrains the pursued. The Phantom's inability to find peace, even when offered genuine opportunities for healing, reflects the complex relationship between justice and mercy, between accountability and forgiveness, between the legitimate desire to ensure that crimes receive appropriate consequences and the equally legitimate need to move beyond trauma toward restoration and growth. The mystery deepens when we consider the presence of the crying child within the Golden Freddy entity, the way William Afton's own son became part of the supernatural force that would ultimately hold his father accountable for crimes that began with accidental tragedy and evolved into deliberate predation. This convergence of victim and family member, of innocent accident and calculated murder, creates layers of irony and complexity that resist easy moral categorization or simple narrative resolution. In the golden eyes that burn with supernatural intensity, in the slumped posture that bears the weight of multiple tragedies, and in the phantom presence that transcends normal limitations of physical existence, we encounter questions about the nature of consciousness that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of the Freddy Fazbear franchise, to encompass universal mysteries about identity, persistence, and the possibility that death represents transition rather than termination. The evolution of Golden Freddy across decades of supernatural manifestation demonstrates the capacity for consciousness to grow and develop beyond the constraints that normally define individual identity, suggesting that posthumous existence might offer opportunities for expansion and transformation that exceed what physical life alone could provide. The Phantom's increasing sophistication and expanding capabilities reflect not simple repetition of established patterns, but genuine spiritual development that challenges assumptions about the static nature of death and the limitations of individual consciousness. Yet this growth comes at a cost that raises profound questions about the relationship between justice and healing, between accountability and peace, between the legitimate desire to ensure that crimes receive appropriate consequences and the equally important need to find resolution that allows all affected parties to move beyond trauma toward restoration. Golden Freddy's apparent inability to accept the healing offered by the Happiest Day ceremony reflects the way intense commitment to justice can become its own form of suffering that persists even when opportunities for relief are genuinely available. The Phantom's persistence in pursuing William Afton across multiple forms of existence, from physical life through mechanical entrapment to digital consciousness, demonstrates both the admirable determination to ensure that crimes against children never go unpunished and the potentially tragic consequences of allowing such determination to become the sole defining characteristic of posthumous existence. The question of whether Golden Freddy's mission represents divine justice or spiritual imprisonment remains unresolved, with implications that affect our understanding of moral accountability and the nature of redemption. The broader significance of the Golden Freddy mystery extends beyond the specific circumstances of its manifestation to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of reality and the relationship between consciousness and physical existence that affect all human experience. The Phantom's apparent ability to transcend normal limitations of space, time, and material constraint suggests that our conventional understanding of what is possible may be incomplete, that reality contains dimensions and possibilities that exceed current scientific and philosophical frameworks. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself feel the melancholy beauty of this story, the way even the darkest tales can carry within them threads of hope and meaning that illuminate aspects of existence that might otherwise remain hidden. The golden bear that watches from shadows represents not simply tragedy but transformation, not merely loss but the persistence of love and justice in forms that transcend the circumstances that created them. Golden Freddy endures because some truths are too important to be forgotten, some injustices too profound to be ignored, and some love too powerful to be extinguished by violence or time. The Phantom serves as a reminder that consciousness possesses depths and capabilities that exceed conventional understanding, that moral accountability operates according to principles that transcend human institutions, and that the victims of terrible crimes are not powerless to seek redress even when earthly systems fail to provide adequate protection or justice. Rest now, knowing that some mysteries are more beautiful for remaining mysterious, some stories more powerful for staying untold in their entirety, and some questions more valuable than any answers they might eventually yield. The golden figure that appears in dreams and shadows continues its eternal vigil, guardian of memories both bitter and sweet, keeper of justice both human and divine, representative of the eternal struggle between light and darkness that defines the deepest aspects of existence itself. In the end, Golden Freddy represents not just individual consciousness pursuing specific objectives, but universal principles of justice and accountability that operate independently of human recognition or approval, ensuring that innocence violated will be defended, that crimes committed will face consequences, and that love expressed through determination to protect others will persist across whatever barriers might be erected to prevent such protection. The mystery continues, as it should, as it must, as long as consciousness seeks to understand the deeper meanings of existence and the relationship between individual experience and cosmic order that shapes all reality according to principles that exceed human comprehension while remaining accessible to human recognition through encounters with phenomena that challenge conventional understanding while affirming fundamental truths about justice, love, and the persistence of moral accountability in a universe where such principles represent not human invention but discovery of laws as fundamental as those that govern physical matter and spiritual essence. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the Golden Guardian watches still, that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that some mysteries reveal their deepest truths not through solutions but through the transformation they create in those who encounter them with openness, courage, and recognition that reality contains wonders that exceed imagination while remaining grounded in love that transcends even the ultimate violation of death itself.